My name is Lisa, and I've always been an adventurer at heart. Born and raised in the bustling city of Phoenix, Arizona, I found solace in nature. The vast deserts, rugged mountains, and ancient canyons of the Southwest called to me, offering a reprieve from the chaos of urban life. But nothing could have prepared me for the encounter I had during a solo hiking trip. In the Navajo Nation night that forever changed my understanding of reality. It was early October, and the weather was perfect for a week-long trek through the Canyon de Chelly National Monument. The canyon, with its towering sandstone cliffs and rich history, had always fascinated me. I planned my route meticulously, ensuring I had all the supplies needed for a safe and enjoyable journey. I arrived at the park just before noon, the sun high in the sky, casting long shadows across the canyon floor. I checked in with the park rangers, who gave me a map and some advice on the best trails and campsites. They also warned me to respect the land and its traditions, a common but serious reminder in this sacred area. The first few days were magical. I hiked through narrow gorges, discovered ancient ruins, and marveled at the petroglyphs etched into the canyon walls. The isolation was invigorating, and I relished the silence, broken only by the occasional call of a hawk or the rustling of leaves in the wind. On the fourth night, I set up camp near a secluded alcove. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I built a small fire, cooked a simple meal, and settled down to enjoy the stars. The sky was a brilliant tapestry of constellations, and I felt a deep sense of peace. That tranquility was shattered around midnight. I was awoken by a strange, distant chanting. It was rhythmic and haunting, carried on the wind from somewhere deep within the canyon. I sat up, my heart racing, straining to hear. The chanting grew louder, more insistent, echoing off the canyon walls. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously stepped out of my tent. The night was still and eerily quiet, except for the persistent chanting. As I scanned the area with my flashlight, I caught a glimpse of movement. In the shadows, a figure, tall and gaunt, standing at the edge of the firelight. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. "Is Sumio nether?" The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, watching me. A wave of fear washed over me as I realized this was no ordinary person. The chanting continued, now louder and more dissonant. The figure began to move, stepping closer to the light. I could see it more clearly now, a man, but with an unnatural, almost skeletal appearance. His eyes glowed with an eerie, otherworldly light. I backed away, my mind racing with stories of Skinwalkers, the shape-shifting witches of Navajo legend. I had always dismissed them as myths, but in that moment, I knew I was wrong. The figure took another step forward, and I could feel its malevolent presence. Desperate, I grabbed a burning stick from the fire and brandished it like a weapon. "Stay back," I shouted. The figure halted, its glowing eyes fixed on the flame. For a moment, we stood in a tense standoff, the chanting filling the air. Then, with a guttural growl, it turned and vanished into the darkness, the chanting fading with it. I stood there, trembling, my mind reeling from what I had just witnessed. I knew I had to leave the canyon immediately. I quickly packed my gear, doused the fire, and set off down the trail, the darkness pressing in around me. The hike back to the park entrance was the longest and most harrowing journey of my life. Every rustle in the bushes, every shadow cast by my flashlight, sent waves of terror through me. I felt as though I was being followed, haunted by the presence of the Skinwalker. I reached the ranger station just before dawn, exhausted and shaken. The rangers looked at me with concern as I recounted my experience. They listened intently, their expressions grave. When I finished, one of them, a Navajo man named Sam, nodded slowly. "You encountered a Skinwalker," he said. "They are real, and they are dangerous. You are lucky to have made it out unharmed." He gave me a small pouch filled with herbs and instructed me to burn them if I ever felt threatened again. "This will help keep them at bay," he said. "But be careful, the canyon is a sacred place, and the spirits there are not to be taken lightly." I thanked him and left, my mind still grappling with the reality of what had happened. In the days that followed, I struggled to process the experience. The logical part of me wanted to dismiss it as a hallucination or a trick of the light, but deep down I knew the truth. The encounter left me with a profound respect for the legends and traditions of the Navajo people. I no longer saw the desert as just a beautiful landscape. It was a place of mystery and power, where ancient forces still held sway. To this day, I carry the pouch of herbs with me whenever I venture into the wilderness. It serves as a reminder of that night and a talisman of protection. And though I continue to explore and seek adventure, I do so with a newfound humility and respect for the unseen. If you ever find yourself in the remote reaches of the Navajo Nation, remember the story. Listen to the warnings, respect the land, and be mindful of the legends. Because sometimes, the things we dismiss as myths are real, and they are watching. My name is Ethan, and this story takes place in the summer of 2017. I was on a cross-country road trip, a personal journey to clear my mind after a messy breakup. I had always found solace in the open road and the endless possibilities it offered. One of my planned stops was the Four Corners region, where Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico meet. The area is rich in Native American history and culture, and I was eager to explore its mysteries. I arrived at a small town on the outskirts of the Navajo Nation late one afternoon. After checking into a modest motel, I struck up a conversation with the owner, a friendly Navajo woman named Marie. She recommended a few local attractions and warned me to be careful while exploring the more remote areas of the reservation. "There are things out there best left undisturbed," she said, with a serious tone that sent a shiver down my spine. The next morning, I set out for a place called Canyon del Muerto, an offshoot of Canyon de Chelly. The name alone intrigued me. Canyon of the Dead. The trailhead was a good hour's drive from the town, and I enjoyed the solitary journey through the rugged landscape. The canyon was breathtaking, its towering red cliffs and ancient ruins. Speaking of a time long past, I spent the day hiking, taking photos, and marveling at the petroglyphs that adorned the canyon walls. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the desert floor, I realized it was time to head back. I was about halfway to my car when I noticed a narrow, overgrown path leading away from the main trail. It wasn't marked on my map, but my curiosity got the better of me. I decided to follow it for a bit, hoping to find something interesting. The path wound through a dense thicket of sagebrush and pion trees, the air growing cooler and more oppressive with each step. After about 20 minutes, I stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood the remnants of an old stone structure, partially collapsed and covered in moss. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, if not centuries. I approached the ruins, feeling an odd sense of unease. There was something about the place that felt wrong. I was trespassing on sacred ground. As I examined the weathered stones, I noticed strange symbols, etched into them marks I didn't recognize, even from my studies of Native American history. The air grew colder, and a sudden gust of wind rustled the leaves around me. I turned to leave, but stopped when I heard a faint whispering. It was barely audible, like voices carried on the wind. I strained to hear, my heart pounding in my chest. "Ethan!" The whisper was clear this time, my name carried on the breeze. I spun around, searching for the source, but there was no one there. Panic set in, and I hurried back down the path, the whispers growing louder and more insistent. "Ethan, you should not be here." I ran, crashing through the underbrush, desperate to reach the main trail. As I broke through the thicket, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the path, a tall, gaunt man, with glowing eyes. He was dressed in traditional Navajo clothing, but there was something deeply wrong about him. His eyes seemed to pierce through me, filled with a malevolent light. I skidded to a halt, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure raised a hand, and the whisper stopped. "You have trespassed," he said, in a voice that echoed through the canyon. "You have awakened the spirits." "I'm sorry," I stammered, backing away. I didn't mean to. Leave now, he commanded, and never return. I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and fled down the path, my legs burning with the effort. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the canyon was now cloaked in shadows. I reached my car just as the last light faded, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. As I drove back to town, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The road seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness pressing in from all sides. When I finally arrived at the motel, I ran inside and locked the door, my heart still racing. Marie was waiting for me in the lobby, her face etched with concern. I warned you, she said softly. The canyon is not a place to be taken lightly. I told her what had happened, and she listened with a grave expression. You encountered a skinwalker, she said. They are powerful witches who can take on the form of animals or other people. They guard the sacred places of our ancestors. She gave me a small pouch filled with herbs and told me to burn them if I ever felt threatened again. It will protect you, she said. But you must never return to that place. I thanked her and returned to my room, still shaken. That night, I had vivid nightmares of the canyon and the glowing-eyed figure. I woke several times, drenched in sweat, convinced that I could hear the whispers outside my window. The next morning I left the town, my sense of adventure thoroughly dampened. I continued my road trip, but the encounter stayed with me, a dark cloud over my journey. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen something I wasn't meant to see, and it left me with a deep respect for the legends and traditions of the Navajo people. Years have passed since that fateful trip, but I still think about it often. I've come to believe that some places are best left unexplored, their mysteries untouched. The world is full of wonders and dangers, and sometimes, the line between the two is thinner than we realize. If you ever find yourself in the Four Corners region, heed the warnings and respect the land. There are ancient forces at work there, and they do not take kindly to trespassers. Remember my story, and be careful where you tread. My name is Jason, and I live in the heart of the Pacific Northwest, where the dense forests and rugged mountains are a playground for outdoor enthusiasts. I've always been an avid hiker and camper, finding peace and solace in the untouched wilderness. But one trip into the deep woods of Washington state changed my perception of nature forever. It was early September, and I decided to take a solo camping trip to a remote area of the Olympic National Forest. The forest is known for its towering trees, lush undergrowth, and tranquil streams. I had visited several times before, but this time, I chose a more secluded spot, far off the beaten path. I parked my car at the trailhead and began my hike, the familiar scent of pine and damp earth filling my senses. The trail was overgrown, indicating that it wasn't frequently traveled. That was exactly what I wanted, a place where I could be alone with my thoughts and the raw beauty of nature. After several hours of hiking, I found a perfect clearing by a small, pristine lake. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and started a campfire. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the water, I settled in for a quiet evening. The night was peaceful at first. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. I cooked a simple meal, enjoyed the star-filled sky, and eventually retreated into my tent for some much-needed rest. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of rustling outside my tent. At first, I thought it was just an animal, perhaps a deer or a raccoon. But then, I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling my campsite. My heart began to race as I listened intently. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent, and I held my breath, straining to hear any other sounds. After a few tense moments, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting an eerie glow on the surrounding trees. Standing just beyond the firelight was a figure, tall and gaunt, with an almost skeletal appearance. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and it wore tattered clothing that looked ancient. My mind raced as I recalled stories of skinwalkers, the shape-shifting witches of Native American lore. I slowly reached for my flashlight and shined it towards the figure. It didn't flinch or move. It just stood there, watching me with those glowing eyes. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I was frozen with fear. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to move, its motions jerky and unnatural. It took a step closer, and I could see its face more clearly, twisted and contorted, with a sinister expression. Desperate, I grabbed a burning stick from the fire and brandished it in front of me. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice cracking. The figure halted, its glowing eyes fixed on the flame. For a moment, we stood in a tense standoff, the crackling of the fire, the only sound in the night. Then, with a guttural growl, it turned and vanished into the darkness, leaving me shaken and terrified. I knew I couldn't stay there. I quickly packed my gear, doused the fire, and started back down the trail, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. Every rustle in the underbrush, every shadow, sent waves of terror through me. I felt as though I was being followed, haunted by the presence of the Skinwalker. The hike back to my car seemed to take forever. When I finally reached the trailhead, I threw my gear into the car and sped off, not stopping until I was miles away from the forest. I didn't sleep that night, my mind racing with what I had seen. In the days that followed, I tried to rationalize the encounter. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or my imagination running wild in the darkness. But deep down, I knew what I had witnessed was real. The figure, with its glowing eyes and malevolent presence, was something out of a nightmare. I spoke to a few friends about it, and one of them, a member of the local Native American community, listened intently. When I finished my story, he nodded slowly. "You encountered a skinwalker," he said. "They are real, and they are dangerous. You are lucky to have made it out unharmed." He gave me a small pouch filled with herbs and instructed me to burn them if I ever felt threatened again. "This will help keep them at bay," he said. "But be careful, the forest is their domain, and they do not take kindly to intruders." The encounter left me with a deep respect for the legends and traditions of the Native American people. I no longer saw the forest as just a beautiful escape. It was a place of mystery and power, where ancient forces still held sway. To this day, I carry the pouch of herbs with me whenever I venture into the wilderness. It serves as a reminder of that night and a talisman of protection. And though I continue to explore and seek adventure, I do so with a newfound humility and respect for the unseen. If you ever find yourself in the remote reaches of the Pacific Northwest, remember this story. Listen to the warnings, respect the land, and be mindful of the legends. Because sometimes, the things we dismiss as myths are real, and they are watching. My name is Alex, and this story takes place during the winter of 2018. I had always been fascinated by the supernatural and the unknown, and I spent much of my free time researching various myths and legends. My curiosity eventually led me to the legend of the Wendigo, malevolent spirit. In Algonquian folklore associated with cannibalism, winter, and insatiable greed. Little did I know that my fascination would turn into a chilling encounter that still haunts me to this day. It started with a simple camping trip. My friends, Sarah and James, and I had decided to spend a weekend in the remote forests of northern Minnesota. We wanted to experience the serene beauty of the winter wilderness, far away from the hustle and bustle of city life. The area we chose was known for its dense forests, frozen lakes, and abundant wildlife, a perfect setting for a winter adventure. We arrived at the trailhead early in the morning, the crisp air biting at our faces as we unloaded our gear. The forest was blanketed in a thick layer of snow, and the trees stood tall and silent, their branches heavy with ice. We set off on our hike, our breath visible in the cold air. The first day was uneventful. We set up camp near a frozen lake, built a fire, and cooked our dinner as the sun set behind the trees. The night was clear, and the stars shone brightly above us. We sat around the fire, sharing stories and laughter, enjoying the tranquility of the wilderness. As the night grew colder, we retreated to our tents. I lay awake for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest, the distant howl of a wolf, the rustling of branches in the wind. I finally drifted off to sleep, feeling at peace with the world. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as I listened more closely, I realized it was a low, guttural growl. My heart began to race as I strained to hear. The growl was followed by a series of snapping branches and heavy footsteps, growing closer to our campsite. I unzipped my tent and peeked outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint glow on the surrounding snow. I could see movement in the shadow, something large and powerful, lurking just beyond the edge of the light. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it towards the source of the noise. What I saw made my blood run cold. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a creature unlike anything I had ever seen. It was tall and emaciated, its skin stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes glowed with an eerie, unnatural light, and its mouth was filled with sharp, yellowed teeth. It stared at me with a hunger that chilled me to the core. I fumbled for my knife, my hands shaking with fear. The creature let out another growl, louder this time, and took a step towards me. I stumbled backwards, nearly falling over as I tried to retreat. "Alex, what's going on?" Sarah's voice called from her tent, filled with alarm. "Stay inside," I shouted, my voice trembling. "There's something out here." The creature snarled and lunged towards me, its long, bony fingers reaching out. I slashed at it with my knife, but it was too fast. It knocked me to the ground, its icy breath filling my nostrils. I could feel its claws digging into my skin, and I screamed in pain. Suddenly, a bright light shone in the creature's eyes. James had emerged from his tent, brandishing a flare. The creature recoiled, hissing and snarling as the light burned its eyes. It released me and fled into the darkness, its growls echoing through the forest. James and Sarah rushed to my side, their faces pale with fear. "What was that thing?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. "A Wendigo," I gasped, clutching my wounded arm. "We need to get out of here." We quickly packed up our camp and set off into the forest, the flare casting an eerie red glow on the snow. We hiked through the night, our senses on high alert, every rustle and snap of a branch sending waves of terror through us. By dawn, we had reached a ranger station. We stumbled inside, exhausted and terrified, and told the rangers what had happened. They listened with grim expressions, their eyes betraying a hint of fear. "You encountered a Wendigo," one of the rangers said. "They're rare, but they do exist. You're lucky to be alive." The rangers treated my wounds and gave us a place to rest. As we sat by the fire, trying to warm ourselves, I couldn't shake the image of the creature from my mind. Its glowing eyes, its insatiable hunger, it was like something out of a nightmare. The encounter left us all deeply shaken. We had gone into the wilderness seeking adventure and tranquility, but we had found something far more sinister. The legend of the Wendigo was no longer just a story, it was a reality we had faced firsthand. In the years since that fateful trip, I've come to respect the power of the legends and the mysteries of the natural world. The forest is a place of beauty and danger, where ancient spirits and creatures still roam. I've continued my research into the supernatural, but I do so with a newfound caution and respect. If you ever find yourself in the remote forests of the Pacific Northwest, remember this story. The Wendigo is real, and it is always watching, waiting for its next victim. Be careful where you tread, and never underestimate the power of the unknown. My name is Liam, and I am a journalist with a penchant for uncovering the eerie and unexplained. My work has taken me to various haunted locales and sites of supposed supernatural activity, but none of my experiences compare to what I encountered on the Navajo reservation in Arizona. It was there that I came face to face with the Skinwalker, and the memory of that encounter still sends shivers down my spine. It all began when I received a tip about strange occurrences in a small, isolated Navajo community. Livestock were disappearing, people reported hearing unsettling noises at night, and there was an air of fear and unease that permeated the area. Intrigued, I packed my gear and headed out, eager to uncover the truth behind these reports. I arrived at the reservation late in the afternoon, the sun casting long shadows over the rugged landscape. The community was small, with modest homes scattered across the arid terrain. I was greeted by an elder named Elu, who had agreed to speak with me about the disturbances. "Elu, thank you for meeting with me," I said, shaking his weathered hand. "Can you tell me more about what's been happening here?" Elu nodded, his eyes grave. "There is an evil presence among us," he said. "It is the Skinwalker, a witch who can take the form of an animal. It preys on our fear and causes suffering. Many have seen it, but few will speak of it." I listened intently as Elu recounted tales of the Skinwalker, passed down through generations. The creature, he explained, was once a human who had gained dark powers through forbidden rituals. It could transform into various animals, mimic voices, and move with unnatural speed and stealth. It thrived on fear and chaos, and its presence brought nothing but misery. "Do you believe it's responsible for the recent events?" I asked. Elu nodded. "There is no doubt. We have seen it, heard it. It walks among us, waiting for its next victim." Determined to uncover the truth, I asked Elu if he would guide me to the areas where the Skinwalker had been sighted. He agreed, though I could see the apprehension in his eyes. Together, we set out into the desert, the sun dipping below the horizon and casting an eerie twilight over the landscape. We reached a secluded area near a rocky outcrop where several incidents had occurred. Elu pointed to the ground, where strange tracks were visible, footprints that abruptly changed into animal prints. My heart raced as I examined the tracks, realizing they were unlike anything I had ever seen. "Elu, these tracks, they're incredible," I said, snapping photos for my report. "Have you ever seen anything like this?" He shook his head. "Only when the Skinwalker is near." As night fell, the desert grew cold and silent. We built a small fire and waited, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the rocks. Elu told me more about the Skinwalker, its powers, its malevolence, and the fear it instilled in the community. Hours passed, and the night grew darker and colder. Just as I began to think the creature wouldn't show, we heard a low, guttural growl echoing through the darkness. My heart pounded as I scanned the area with my flashlight, the beam cutting through the night. "Elu, did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He nodded, his face tense with fear. "It is here. Be still, and do not show fear." The growl grew louder, accompanied by the sound of rustling and snapping branches. I shone my flashlight towards the source of the noise, and my blood ran cold. Standing at the edge of the firelight was a creature, its form shifting and distorted. One moment, it appeared as a coyote, and the next, it took on a humanoid shape, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. I gasped, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. The creature let out a chilling howl, and advanced towards us, its movements fluid and unnatural. Elu began chanting softly, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. The Skinwalker stopped, its glowing eyes fixed on Elu. It let out a hiss, a sound filled with hatred and malice. I could feel its malevolent energy, a tangible force that sent waves of terror through me. "Elu, what do we do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Do not move," he replied, his chanting growing louder. "We must stand our ground." The Skinwalker snarled and circled us, its eyes never leaving Elu. I watched in awe as Elu continued his chant, his words powerful and commanding. Slowly, the creature began to retreat, its form shifting and blurring until it vanished into the darkness. We stood there in stunned silence, the night suddenly quiet and still. Elu's chanting ceased, and he turned to me, his expression weary but resolute. It is gone for now, he said. But it will return. It always does. We made our way back to the community, the encounter leaving me shaken and bewildered. I spent the next few days interviewing residents and gathering more stories of the Skinwalker. Each tale was filled with fear and despair, painting a grim picture of the creature's influence on the community. As I prepared to leave, Elu gave me a small pouch filled with herbs and a piece of silver. "This will protect you," he said. "The Skinwalker is powerful, but it can be repelled. Remember our ways and respect the spirits." I thanked him and promised to share their story with the world. The experience left me with a deep respect for the Navajo traditions and a chilling understanding of the supernatural forces that exist in our world. Back home, I published my article, detailing the harrowing encounters and the resilience of the Navajo people. The story received widespread attention, sparking debates and discussions about the existence of skinwalkers and other supernatural beings. To this day, the memory of that night in the desert lingers in my mind. The image of the shifting creature, the sound of Ellis chanting, and the palpable sense of Evelyn's something ill. Never forget. The Skinwalker is real, and its presence serves as a reminder of the mysteries and dangers that lurk in the shadows of our world. If you ever find yourself in the remote deserts of the Southwest, remember this story. Respect the land, honor the traditions, and always be aware of the unseen forces that dwell in the darkness. For sometimes, the legends are real, and they are closer than we think. My name is Rachel, and this story is one I wish I could forget. It was the fall of 2019, and my friends and I had decided to take a road trip through the southwestern United States. We were a close-knit group, eager to escape our mundane routines and experience the vast, open landscapes of Arizona and New Mexico. Our journey took us through picturesque deserts, ancient canyons, and quaint small towns. On the third day of our trip, we found ourselves near the Navajo reservation. I had always been fascinated by Native American culture and legends, and I convinced my friends to take a detour to explore the area. We arrived at a small, isolated town just before sunset. The locals were friendly but reserved, their eyes wary as they watched us. We stopped at a local diner for dinner, where I struck up a conversation with an elderly Navajo woman named Nava. She had a kind face, but her eyes held a depth of wisdom and sorrow. "You should not be here after dark," Nava warned as we chatted. "There are things in these lands that do not take kindly to outsiders." "What do you mean?" I asked, intrigued. "The Skinwalker," she said in a hushed tone. "An evil spirit that can take the form of animals, or even people. It is a witch who has forsaken humanity for power. If you see it, do not engage. It will bring nothing but suffering." Her words sent a chill down my spine, but my friends and I brushed it off as a local legend meant to scare tourists. We thanked Nava for her advice and decided to camp out in the desert, eager to experience the wilderness under the stars. We found a secluded spot near a rocky outcrop, set up our tents, and built a fire. The night was clear, and the sky was a dazzling canvas of stars. We shared stories, laughed, and marveled at the beauty of the desert night. As the hours passed, the temperature dropped, and the fire dwindled to embers. We decided to call it a night and retreated to our tents. I lay awake for a while, listening to the distant howls of coyotes and the rustling of the wind. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange noise. It was a low, guttural growl, unlike anything I had ever heard. My heart pounded as I listened, trying to make sense of the sound. It seemed to be coming from just outside my tent. I unzipped the flap and peered out into the darkness. The moon cast an eerie glow on the desert landscape, and I could see the silhouette of a large, four-legged creature moving stealthily among the rocks. It looked like a coyote, but there was something off about its movement, something almost human. "Guys, wake up," I whispered urgently, crawling out of my tent. My friends, Emma and Jake, emerged groggily from their tents, their faces etched with confusion and concern. "What's going on?" Emma asked. Look, I said, pointing towards the creature. Jake grabbed a flashlight and shone it in the direction I indicated. The beam of light illuminated the creature, revealing its true form. It was indeed a coyote, but its eyes glowed with an unnatural, malevolent light. It stood there, staring at us, its mouth twisted into a snarl. "That's not a normal coyote," Jake said, his voice trembling. The creature let out a chilling howl and began to transform. Its limbs elongated, its fur receding to reveal pale, human-like skin. Within moments, it stood on two legs, its form grotesque and twisted. The glowing eyes and snarling mouth remained, a horrifying blend of man and beast. "Run!" I shouted, my voice breaking with terror. We scrambled to our feet and ran towards the car, footsteps crunching on the desert sand. The Skinwalker pursued us, moving with unnatural speed and agility. I could feel its hot breath on my neck as we reached the car and fumbled with the keys. Jake managed to unlock the doors, and we piled in, slamming them shut just as the creature reached us. It clawed at the windows, its eyes burning with rage. Emma started the car, and we sped off, the tires kicking up a cloud of dust. We drove for what felt like hours, the Skinwalker's howls fading into the distance. When we finally stopped, we were miles away from our campsite, our hearts still racing with fear. "What the hell was that?" Emma asked, her voice shaking. "A Skinwalker," I said, recalling Nava's warning. "We need to get out of here, now." We didn't sleep that night, and at first light, we drove to the nearest town. We found a motel and checked in, too exhausted and terrified to continue our journey. I called the local authorities and reported the encounter, but they dismissed it as a wild animal sighting. We spent the rest of the trip in a state of constant vigilance, avoiding any remote areas and sticking to well-populated places. The memory of the Skinwalker haunted us, and the fear that it might still be following us lingered in the back of our minds. When we finally returned home, delved deeper into the legend of the Skinwalker. I learned about the Navajo rituals and protections used to ward off these malevolent beings. I even reached out to Nava, who sent me a blessed talisman for protection. To this day, the encounter remains the most terrifying experience of my life. I've come to respect and fear the ancient legends of the Navajo, understanding that there are forces in this world beyond our comprehension. If you ever find yourself in the deserts of the Southwest, remember this story. Respect the land and its people, and be wary of the shadows that move in the night. For the Skinwalker is real, and it is always watching, waiting for its next victim. My name is Aaron, and I've spent most of my life searching for the strange and unexplained. As an investigator of the paranormal, I've seen things that defy logic and reason, but nothing compares to my encounter with the Skinwalker. It was a case that began with a simple phone call and ended in a nightmare that I still struggle to understand. It all started in the spring of 2018, when I received a call from a desperate woman named Marie. She lived on the outskirts of a small town in New Mexico, not far from the Navajo reservation. Her voice trembled as she described the terrifying events that had been plaguing her family. "We need help," Marie said, her voice cracking with emotion. "There's something out here, something evil. It's been tormenting us for weeks. Please, you have to come." Her plea was sincere, and I couldn't ignore it. I packed my gear and drove out to her property, a remote ranch surrounded by miles of desolate desert. When I arrived, I was greeted by Marie and her husband Tom. They looked exhausted, their faces drawn and pale. "Thank you for coming," Marie said, her eyes filled with gratitude. "We didn't know who else to turn to." "Tell me what's been happening," I said, setting up my equipment. Marie and Tom led me to their living room, where they recounted their harrowing experiences. It had started with strange noises at night, owls, growls, and whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. Then, they began finding mutilated livestock, their remains scattered around the property. But the worst part was the sightings. "We've seen it," Tom said, his voice steady but grim. "A creature that looks like a wolf or a coyote, but it's not natural. Its eyes. They're human. Marie shuddered and added, and it can change. One moment, it's an animal, and the next, it's standing on two legs, looking like a twisted version of a man. The fear in their voices was palpable, and I knew they were telling the truth. I had heard similar accounts before, legends of the Skinwalker, a witch who could transform into animals and mimic voices, a creature of pure evil that thrived on fear. Well, start by setting up cameras and motion sensors around the property, I said, trying to sound reassuring. And I'll stay here overnight to see if we can capture any evidence. Tom and Marie nodded, grateful for the help. We spent the rest of the day setting up the equipment, positioning cameras at strategic points around the ranch. As night fell, a sense of unease settled over us. We gathered in the living room, the flickering light of the fireplace casting long shadows on the walls. Tom and Marie went to bed, leaving me alone to monitor the cameras. The hours passed slowly, the silence of the desert pressing in on me. Just after midnight, the motion sensors triggered, and the monitors lit up. I saw movement near the barn, shadowy figure creeping through the darkness. I grabbed my flashlight and camera, my heart pounding as I stepped outside. The night was cold and still, the only sound the crunch of gravel under my boots. I approached the barn, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Suddenly, I heard a low growl, and my blood ran cold. I turned and saw a large, wolf-like creature, with glowing eyes. It stared at me, its gaze piercing and malevolent. I raised my camera, but before I could take a picture, it began to change. Its limbs elongated, its fur receding to reveal pale, human-like skin. It stood on two legs, its form grotesque and twisted. "Who are you?" I whispered, fear choking my voice. The creature let out a guttural snarl and lunged at me. I stumbled backward, dropping my flashlight. The darkness closed in, and I felt a searing pain as its claws raked across my arm. I managed to scramble to my feet and run back to the house, slamming the door shut behind me. I locked the doors and windows, my heart racing. I could hear the creature outside, its growls and scratches echoing through the night. Tom and Marie rushed into the living room, their faces pale with fear. "It's here," I gasped, clutching my bleeding arm. "We need to stay inside." We huddled together, listening to the creature's relentless assault. It seemed to go on forever, the hours stretching into an eternity. Eventually, the growls subsided, and silence fell over the ranch. At dawn, we cautiously ventured outside. The creature was gone, but the evidence of its attack was clear: claw marks on the door, blood on the ground. I knew we couldn't stay there any longer. "We have to leave," I said, helping Tom and Marie gather their belongings. "It's not safe here." They agreed, and we packed up their truck, preparing to leave the ranch behind. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the Skinwalker was still watching us, waiting for another chance to strike. Marie and Tom moved to a different state, far from the haunted desert. I continued my work as a paranormal investigator, but the encounter left a deep scar. The memory of the Skinwalker's stare, its eyes filled with malevolent intelligence, haunted my dreams. I've shared this story with others, warning them of the dangers that lurk in the remote corners of our world. The Skinwalker is real, a creature of legend and fear, and it's out there, watching and waiting. If you ever find yourself in the deserts of the Southwest, remember this tale. Be cautious, respect the land, and never underestimate the power of the supernatural. For the Skinwalker is always near, and its hunger for fear is unending. My name is David, and I've always been an avid outdoorsman. Growing up in the rugged terrain of northern Arizona, the wilderness was my playground. Hiking, camping, and hunting were second nature to me. But one encounter in the dense pines of the Coconino National Forest changed my perception of the outdoors forever. It was late September of 2021, and I had planned a solo hunting trip deep in the forest. The weather was perfect, crisp and cool, with the scent of pine in the air. I packed my gear, loaded my rifle, and set out early in the morning, eager for the peace and solitude that only nature could provide. I hiked for miles, following game trails and listening to the sounds of the forest. By late afternoon, I had reached a remote area that few ventured into. I set up camp near a small clearing, with a good view of the surrounding woods. As the sun began to set, I settled in for the night, my campfire crackling and casting flickering shadows on the trees. The first night was uneventful, and I awoke at dawn feeling refreshed and ready for the day. I spent the morning tracking deer, but by noon, I hadn't had any luck. I decided to head back to camp for lunch and a brief rest before continuing my hunt. As I approached my campsite, I noticed something odd. The firewood I had neatly stacked was scattered, and my gear had been rummaged through. At first, I thought it might have been an animal, but then I saw the tracks large canine prints that led away from my camp and into the forest. My heart sank as I examined the prints. They were too large to be a coyote or even a wolf. I had heard stories of strange creatures in these woods, but I had always dismissed them as myths and legends. Now, standing there with the evidence before me, I wasn't so sure. I decided to follow the tracks, my curiosity piqued, despite the growing sense of unease. The prints led deeper into the forest, winding through dense underbrush and over rocky terrain. I moved cautiously, my rifle at the ready, scanning the surroundings for any sign of movement. After about an hour of tracking, I came to a small clearing. The tracks ended abruptly, and I looked around, trying to make sense of it. Suddenly, I heard a rustling in the bushes to my left. I turned, raising my rifle, and froze. Standing at the edge of the clearing was a creature unlike anything I had ever seen. It was tall, with the body of a man, but the head and fur of a wolf. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its mouth was twisted into a snarl. The stories I had heard as a child came flooding back to Mokele of the Skinwalker, a shape-shifting witch that could take the form of animals. The creature stared at me, its eyes boring into mine. I felt a wave of fear wash over me, but I forced myself to remain calm. I had faced danger before, but this was different. This was something ancient and evil. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice steady despite the terror I felt. The creature didn't respond. Instead, it let out a low growl and began to move towards me, its movements fluid and unnaturally fast. I took a step back, my finger on the trigger, ready to defend myself. Suddenly, it stopped, tilting its head as if listening to something. Then, without warning, it turned and disappeared into the trees, moving with a speed that defied logic. I stood there, my heart pounding, trying to process what had just happened. I knew I couldn't stay in the forest. I needed to get back to civilization and report what I had seen. I hurried back to my campsite, packed up my gear, and started the long hike back to my truck. The whole time, I felt like I was being watched, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. When I finally reached my truck, I drove straight to the nearest ranger station and reported the encounter. The rangers listened to my story with skepticism, but agreed to investigate. I knew they didn't believe me, but I couldn't blame them. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I wouldn't have believed it either. I returned home, but the memory of the Skinwalker haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching and waiting. I spent hours researching the legend, trying to understand what I had encountered. The Navajo believe that the Skinwalker is a witch who has forsaken humanity for power, using dark magic to transform into animals. I reached out to a Navajo elder named Elsie, hoping to learn more. She agreed to meet with me and listen patiently as I recounted my experience. "You have encountered a powerful and dangerous being," Elsie said, her voice calm but serious. "The Skinwalker is not to be taken lightly. It feeds on fear and thrives in the darkness. You must protect yourself." She gave me a pouch of sacred herbs and instructed me to burn them if I ever encountered the Skinwalker again. She also taught me a prayer for protection, which I committed to memory. Despite her reassurances, I remained vigilant. The encounter had shaken me to my core, and I knew I would never look at the forest the same way again. I continued my outdoor adventures, but I was always cautious, always aware of the possibility that the Skinwalker could be lurking nearby. Months passed, and I gradually began to relax, the memory of the encounter fading into the background of my mind. But then, one night, as I was camping in a different part of the forest, I heard it again, the same low growl that had haunted my dreams. I froze, my heart racing, and reached for the pouch of herbs Elsie had given me. I lit them with trembling hands, the smoke rising into the night air. I recited the prayer she had taught me, my voice steady but filled with fear. The growl grew louder, and I saw the glowing eyes in the darkness, watching me. But this time, I was prepared. The smoke from the herbs seemed to have an effect, and the creature hesitated, its eyes narrowing. I continued to recite the prayer, my voice growing stronger. The Skinwalker let out a snarl and backed away, disappearing into the trees once more. I stood there, shaking but relieved. The protection had worked. Since then, I've had no further encounters with the Skinwalker. But I know it's still out there, lurking in the shadows of the forest. A constant reminder that there are things in this world that defy explanation. If you ever venture into the wilderness, remember my story. Be cautious, respect the land, and always be prepared. For the Skinwalker is real, and it is always watching, waiting for its next victim. My name is Elizabeth, and I never considered myself a believer in the paranormal. Ghost stories were just that, stories. But my time at Pine Ridge changed all that. This tale is about my experience with the supernatural, and it's something you'll never forget. It was the summer of 2019, and I was a college student looking for a summer job. Pine Ridge, a quaint little bed and breakfast nestled in the Appalachian Mountains, was hiring. The idea of spending my summer in such a picturesque location was appealing, so I applied and was thrilled when I got the job. Pine Ridge was owned by an elderly couple, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson. They were warm and welcoming, and the B&B had a charming, old-world feel. I was assigned to help with housekeeping and occasionally assist in the kitchen. The work was straightforward, and the guests were generally pleasant. It wasn't long after I arrived that I started hearing the stories. The other staff would whisper about the hauntings, claiming that the B&B was home to restless spirits. They told tales of strange noises, cold spots, and apparitions. I brushed it off as local folklore. After all, old houses made noises, and drafts were common in such buildings. One evening, after a particularly busy day, I was alone in the kitchen cleaning up. The sun had set, and the house was quiet. I was lost in thought, scrubbing a pot, when I heard a soft, melodic humming. I stopped, listening intently. The sound seemed to come from the hallway. "Hello?" I called out, but there was no response. I set the pot down and wiped my hands, stepping into the hallway. The humming continued, growing louder as I approached the staircase. I looked up and saw a figure standing at the top of the stairs. It was a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned gown, her hair cascading over her shoulders. My heart pounded in my chest. I blinked, and she was gone. The humming ceased, leaving me in silence. I stood there, trying to rationalize what I had seen. It had to be a trick of the light, or maybe one of the guests playing a prank. I returned to the kitchen, my mind racing. I didn't mention the incident to anyone, not wanting to appear foolish. But over the next few days, more strange things began to happen. Doors would open and close on their own, lights would flicker, and I would hear faint whispers when no one was around. One night, I was in my room, reading a book, when I heard a knock on my door. I opened it to find no one there. Annoyed, I stepped into the hallway and looked around. The house was quiet, the only sound the creaking of the old floorboards. I was about to go back to my room when I felt a chill. The air grew cold, and I saw my breath fog in front of me. Suddenly, felt a presence. as if someone was standing right behind me. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. I backed into my room, shutting the door behind me. My heart was racing, and I felt a growing sense of dread. I didn't sleep that night, my mind filled with thoughts of the ghostly woman on the stairs and the cold, empty presence in the hallway. The next morning, decided to talk to Mrs. Thompson. She was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast for the guests. I hesitated, unsure of how to bring up the subject. "Mrs. Thompson," I began, my voice trembling slightly. "Have you ever experienced anything strange in the house?" She looked at me with a knowing smile. "You've seen her, haven't you?" I nodded, feeling a wave of relief that I wasn't alone. She set down the bowl she was holding and motioned for me to sit. "Pine Ridge has a history," she said softly. "The woman you saw is Elizabeth. She was the original owner's wife, and she died here many years ago. Some say she's never left." I listened in rapt attention as Mrs. Thompson told me Elizabeth's story. She had been a young bride, deeply in love with her husband. But tragedy struck when he was killed in a hunting accident. Heartbroken, Elizabeth withdrew from the world, spending her days wandering the halls of Pine Ridge, humming a melancholy tune. One stormy night, she fell down the stairs and died from her injuries. "She's been here ever since," Mrs. Thompson said, her eyes sad. "We've all seen her at one time or another. She means no harm, she's just lost." The revelation left me both fascinated and uneasy. I had never believed in ghosts, but the experiences I had couldn't be easily explained away. I decided to stay and finish the summer, determined to learn more about Elizabeth and the history of Pine Ridge. Over the next few weeks, I continued to experience strange occurrences. But now, instead of fear, felt a sense of connection. I began to leave small offerings for Elizabeth Lowers from the garden, a favorite book. The atmosphere in the house seemed to change, becoming more peaceful. One evening, as I was closing up the kitchen, felt a presence behind me. I turned to see Elizabeth standing there, her eyes filled with sadness. She didn't speak, but her expression conveyed a deep, unending sorrow. I felt a surge of empathy and whispered, "I'm sorry for your loss." To my astonishment, she smiled a fleeting, ghostly smiling, then she was gone. The kitchen felt warmer, and the air seemed lighter. I knew in that moment that Elizabeth had found some measure of peace. When the summer ended, I left Pine Ridge with a heavy heart. The Thompsons thanked me for my help, and I promised to visit again. As I drove away, I looked back at the old house, its windows reflecting the morning sun. I knew I had left a part of myself there, and I would never forget my time with Elizabeth. Years have passed since that summer, but I still think of Pine Ridge often. I've shared my story with friends and family, some of whom are skeptical, others who listen with wide-eyed wonder. I don't expect everyone to believe me, but I know what I experienced. If you ever find yourself at Pine Ridge, listen for the soft, melodic humming. You might catch a glimpse of a ghostly figure on the stairs, a reminder of a love that transcended time and death. And if you do, remember to show kindness and respect. For Elizabeth is still there, wandering the halls, waiting for the day she can finally rest. My name is Sarah, and I've always been fascinated by the supernatural. Growing up in a small town in Nevada, I heard countless stories about haunted places, cryptids, and mysterious events. But it wasn't until I encountered the Skinwalker in Red Rock Canyon that I truly understood the terror these legends could hold. It was the summer of 2022, and I had just graduated from college. I decided to take a road trip with my best friends, Emily and Jake, to celebrate. We planned to explore some of the most beautiful and remote areas of the Southwest, and Red Rock Canyon was at the top of our list. We arrived at the canyon on a hot July afternoon. The red sandstone cliffs glowed in the sunlight, and the air was filled with the scent of sagebrush and juniper. We set up our campsite near a small creek, eager to spend a few days hiking and enjoying the natural beauty of the area. The first day was perfect. We hiked for miles, marveling at the towering rock formations and the vibrant desert flora. As the sun began to set, we returned to our campsite, tired but happy. We built a fire, roasted marshmallows, and shared stories under the stars. That night, as we lay in our tents, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was a low, guttural growl, unlike anything I had ever heard before. I sat up, straining to hear more. The sound came again, closer this time. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to Emily, who was in the tent next to mine. "Yeah," she replied, her voice trembling. "What do you think it is?" "I don't know," I said, my mind racing. "Maybe a coyote or a mountain lion." We lay there, listening to the strange noises outside. The growling was accompanied by the sound of something moving through the underbrush, circling our campsite. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized whatever it was getting closer. Suddenly, there was a loud crash, and the growling stopped. I heard Jake's voice, panicked and urgent. "Guys, get out here, now!" We scrambled out of our tents, flashlights in hand, and ran to where Jake was standing. He was pointing at something in the darkness, his face pale with fear. I followed his gaze and saw a figure standing at the edge of our campsite. It was tall, with long, matted hair and eyes that glowed eerily in the beam of our flashlights. Its body was covered in what looked like animal hides, and its hands were twisted into grotesque claws. The creature let out a low, menacing growl, and I felt a wave of terror wash over me. "Skinwalker," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. The creature moved closer, and we backed away, our hearts pounding. I had heard stories of skinwalkers, shape-shifting witches from Navajo legend who could take the form of animals. But I had never believed they were real until now. "Run!" I shouted, and we bolted towards the creek, the creature hot on our heels. We ran for what felt like hours, the sound of our pursuers' growls echoing through the canyon. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but I didn't dare stop. Finally, we reached a narrow ravine and squeezed through the rocks, hoping to lose the creature in the maze of stone. We crouched in the darkness, trying to catch our breath. The growling had stopped, but I could still feel the presence of the skinwalker nearby. We huddled together, too scared to speak, waiting for dawn. When the first light of morning finally broke, we cautiously made our way back to our campsite. The fire had burned out, and our tents were shredded, as if something had torn through them with incredible force. We quickly packed up what was left of our gear and hiked back to the car, our nerves frayed and our bodies exhausted. As we drove away from Red Rock Canyon, we tried to make sense of what had happened. None of us could deny what we had seen, but we knew that telling others would be met with skepticism and disbelief. We decided to keep the encounter to ourselves, a shared secret that bonded us together in a way nothing else could. Over the next few weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I had nightmares about the skinwalker, its glowing eyes haunting my dreams. I did some research, hoping to find a way to protect myself. I learned that the Navajo believed skinwalkers could be driven away with sacred herbs and rituals. I reached out to a Navajo elder named Thomas, hoping he could help. He agreed to meet with me and listened patiently as I recounted my experience. "You encountered a powerful and dangerous being," Thomas said, his voice grave. "The skinwalker is not to be taken lightly. They feed on fear and thrive in darkness." He gave me a pouch of sacred herbs and instructed me to burn them if I ever felt the presence of the skinwalker again. He also taught me a prayer for protection, which I committed to memory. Despite his reassurances, I remained vigilant. The encounter had left me deeply shaken, and I knew I would never look at the desert the same way again. I continued my outdoor adventures, but I was always cautious, always aware of the possibility that the skinwalker could be lurking nearby. Months passed, and I gradually began to relax, the memory of the encounter fading into the background of my mind. But then, one night, as I was camping in a different part of the desert, I heard it again, same low growl that had haunted my dreams. I froze, my heart racing, and reached for the pouch of herbs Thomas had given me. I lit them with trembling hands, the smoke rising into the night air. I recited the prayer he had taught me, my voice steady but filled with fear. The growl grew louder, and I saw the glowing eyes in the darkness, watching me. But this time, I was prepared. The smoke from the herbs seemed to have an effect, and the creature hesitated, its eyes narrowing. I continued to recite the prayer, my voice growing stronger. The Skinwalker let out a snarl and backed away, disappearing into the shadows once more. I stood there, shaking but relieved. The protection had worked. Since then, I've had no further encounters with the Skinwalker. But I know it's still out there, lurking in the shadows of the desert. A constant reminder that there are things in this world that defy explanation. If you ever venture into the wilderness, remember my story. Be cautious, respect the land, and always be prepared. For the Skinwalker is real, and it is always watching, waiting for its next victim. My name is David, and I am a journalist who has always been drawn to the strange and unexplained. Over the years, I've investigated countless mysteries, but nothing could have prepared me for the events that unfolded in the swamps of South Carolina. This is the story of the lizard man of Scape or Swamp. It was the spring of 2021, and I was working on a series of articles about cryptids across the United States. The lizard man, a creature reported to have scales, glowing red eyes, and a terrifying roar, had long been a local legend in Bishopville, South Carolina. Sightings dated back to the 1980s, with stories of cars being damaged and livestock disappearing. Skeptics dismissed it as a hoax, but the accounts were consistent enough to pique my interest. I arrived in Bishopville on a warm, humid afternoon. The town was small, with a close-knit community that seemed both wary and intrigued by my presence. I checked into a modest motel and began to ask around about the lizard man. Most people were reluctant to talk, either out of fear or skepticism, but a few mentioned a man named Hank Miller, who claimed to have seen the creature up close. Hank lived in a rundown cabin on the edge of Scape or Swamp. I drove out to meet him, navigating the winding dirt roads that led into the dense, shadowy wilderness. The swamp was a hauntingly beautiful place, teeming with life and shrouded in an eerie silence. When I arrived at Hank's cabin, I found him sitting on the porch. A weathered man in his 60s, with a grizzled beard and piercing blue eyes. He greeted me with a wary nod and invited me inside. The cabin was cluttered but cozy, filled with the scent of tobacco and old wood. "So, you want to hear about the lizard man?" Hank said, lighting a cigarette and taking a deep drag. "I've seen him, all right, and let me tell you, it's not something you forget." He recounted his story, describing a night in the summer of 1988 when he had been out fishing in the swamp. He had felt something watching him, a presence that sent chills down his spine. As he made his way back to his boat, he saw it, a hulking figure with scaly skin, red eyes glowing in the darkness. It was like nothing it ever seen before, Hank said, his voice trembling slightly. It let out this roar, and I ran like hell. Never went back to that part of the swamp again. I listened intently, taking notes and asking questions. Hank's account was compelling, but I needed more evidence. He mentioned that some locals believed the lizard man was a cursed being, a former human transformed by dark magic. The stories varied, but they all hinted at an ancient curse that plagued the swamp. Determined to uncover the truth, I decided to spend a few nights camping in Scape or Swamp. Hank offered to guide me to a secluded spot where sightings were most common. We packed our gear and set out early the next morning, navigating through the dense foliage and murky waters. The swamp was alive with the sounds of chirping birds and croaking frogs. The air was thick with humidity, and the ground was soft and treacherous. As we made our way deeper into the wilderness, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. We set up camp near a small clearing, the trees casting long shadows as the sun began to set. Hank built a fire, and we sat in silence, listening to the sounds of the swamp. As night fell, The atmosphere grew even more oppressive, the darkness seemingly alive with unseen threats. Around midnight, we heard a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down my spine. Hank's eyes widened, and he motioned for me to stay quiet. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. We grabbed our flashlights and scanned the surrounding trees. The beams of light cut through the darkness, but revealed nothing. The growling continued, growing louder and more menacing. I felt my heart race, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Suddenly, there was a loud crash, and we turned to see a figure emerging from the shadows. It was massive, standing at least 7 feet tall, with scaly skin that glistened in the flashlight beams. Its eyes glowed a sinister red, and it let out a deafening roar that echoed through the swamp. We stumbled back, struggling to comprehend what we were seeing. The creature advanced, its movements swift and deliberate. Hank shouted for me to run, and we took off into the darkness, our flashlights bouncing wildly. We ran for what felt like an eternity, the creature's roars, growing fainter, but never disappearing entirely. Finally, we reached the edge of the swamp and collapsed, gasping for breath. Hank's face was pale, and I could see the fear in his eyes. "We need to leave," he said urgently. "This thing, it's not just a legend. It's real, and it's dangerous." We quickly packed up our gear and made our way back to Hank's cabin. As we drove, the events of the night replayed in my mind. The lizard man was real, and we had encountered it up close. But the question remained, what was it? Back at the cabin, Hank shared more about the local legends. According to one story, the lizard man was once a man named Samuel, who had lived in the area in the early 1800s. He had been a reclusive figure, rumored to dabble in dark magic. One night, a terrible storm swept through the swamp, and Samuel disappeared. In the days that followed, sightings of a strange creature began to emerge. "Some say he was cursed," Hank explained. "Transformed into that thing as punishment for his dark deeds." I listened, fascinated and horrified. The story seemed far-fetched, but after what I had witnessed, I couldn't dismiss it outright. Determined to learn more, I decided to visit the local library and dig into the town's history. The next day, I pored over old newspapers and records, searching for any mention of Samuel or the lizard man. I found several accounts of strange sightings and unexplained disappearances over the years, but nothing concrete. The stories varied, but they all painted a picture of a creature that haunted the swamp, an enduring presence that defied explanation. As I delved deeper, I came across a diary from the 1800s, written by a local woman named Abigail. She described her encounters with Samuel, a man she claimed was kind and gentle, but plagued by dark forces. Her final entry mentioned the storm and Samuel's disappearance, along with a cryptic warning to stay away from the swamp. Armed with this new information, I returned to Hank's cabin. We spent hours discussing the diary and the possible origins of the lizard man. Hank was convinced that the curse was real, and that Samuel's spirit still roamed the swamp, trapped in a monstrous form. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the creature, its glowing eyes and terrifying roar. I decided to return to the swamp one last time, hoping to capture definitive evidence of its existence. I set out alone, navigating through the dense foliage until I reached the clearing where we had camped. The swamp was eerily quiet, the air heavy with anticipation. I set up a camera and waited, my senses on high alert. Hours passed, and just as I was beginning to lose hope, I heard a low growl, followed by the sound of footsteps. I turned on my flashlight and saw the lizard man emerging from the shadows. It stood there, watching me, its eyes glowing with an unsettling intelligence. I raised my camera, capturing the creature in all its terrifying glory. It let out a roar and advanced, but I stood my ground, determined to get the evidence I needed. The lizard man stopped, its gaze fixed on me, and for a moment, I felt a strange connection, as if it recognized me. Then, just as suddenly, it turned and disappeared into the darkness. I stood there, heart pounding, unsure of what had just happened. I packed up my gear and made my way back to the cabin, my mind racing. The footage I captured was clear and undeniable. The lizard man was real, and I had the proof. I shared my findings with Hank, and we both agreed to keep the location secret, to protect both the creature and the people of Bishopville. I wrote my article, detailing the history and my encounters with the lizard man, but I left out the specifics of the location. The response was overwhelming, with readers fascinated and terrified by the story. To this day, I still think about the lizard man and the curse that binds it to scape or swamp. The experience changed me, deepening my appreciation for the mysteries of the world and the stories that endure through time. And whenever I hear the low growl of an unseen creature, I remember that night in the swamp, and the eyes that watched me, full of an ancient and unsettling wisdom. My name is Sarah, and I'm a travel blogger who loves to explore off-the-beaten-path destinations. I had heard whispers about the Skinwalker Ranch in Utah for years, a place said to be haunted by the terrifying shapeshifters known as Skinwalkers. Intrigued and eager to uncover the truth, I decided to make it the subject of my next adventure. What follows is a story I still struggle to believe, a tale of terror that has forever changed the way I see the world. It was early fall when I arrived in northeastern Utah. The landscape was breathtaking, with its vast open spaces and rugged beauty. But there was an underlying sense of unease that I couldn't quite shake. The locals were wary of the ranch, and few were willing to talk about it. Those who did warned me to stay away, their eyes filled with fear. Undeterred, I rented a small cabin near the edge of the ranch. The property was isolated, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to close in on me as I drove up the gravel path. The cabin itself was old but well maintained, with a rustic charm that belied the dark stories surrounding the area. My first night was uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next day, I ventured into the nearby town of Ballard to gather information. Most people avoided my questions, but an elderly woman named Margaret agreed to speak with me. She invited me into her home, a quaint house filled with the scent of freshly baked bread and old wood. Margaret told me about the history of the ranch, how it had been a place of strange occurrences and unexplainable phenomena for centuries. The Ute tribe, who lived in the area long before settlers arrived, believed the land was cursed and inhabited by Skinwalker evil beings capable of transforming into any animal they desired. These creatures are not to be trifled with, Margaret warned, her voice trembling slightly. They are powerful and malevolent. If you see one, you must leave immediately. I thanked her for the information, though her words only fueled my curiosity. That afternoon I returned to the ranch, determined to explore its depths. The air was thick with anticipation as I made my way through the dense woods, the sounds of the forest providing a haunting soundtrack to my journey. As the sun began to set, I reached a clearing where an old, dilapidated farmhouse stood. It looked abandoned, with broken windows and overgrown weeds, but there was something about it that drew me in. I approached cautiously, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The inside of the farmhouse was dark and musty, with the remnants of a life long gone. Broken furniture, scattered papers, and shattered glass littered the floor. I felt a chill run down my spine as I explored the rooms, each one filled with a sense of foreboding. In one of the upstairs bedrooms, I found a journal tucked away in a drawer. The pages were yellowed with age, and the handwriting was difficult to read, but it told the story of a family who had once lived there. They had experienced strange occurrences, moving on their own, eerie noises at night, and sightings of a large, wolf-like creature. As I read the journal, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the farmhouse was plunged into darkness. I decided it was time to leave, but as I turned to go, I heard a low growl coming from downstairs. My heart pounded in my chest as I crept toward the staircase, the growling growing louder with each step. At the bottom of the stairs, I saw a massive, black wolf with glowing red eyes. It stared at me, its gaze piercing and malevolent. I froze, unsure of what to do. The wolf let out a bone-chilling howl, and I knew I had to get out of there. I ran out of the farmhouse, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I sprinted through the woods. The growls and howls followed me, echoing through the trees. I didn't stop until I reached my cabin, slamming the door behind me and locking it tight. I spent the rest of the night huddled in a corner listening to the sounds outside. The growls eventually faded, but the sense of dread remained. The next morning, I decided to leave the area, my curiosity replaced by a deep-seated fear. As I packed my belongings, I noticed strange markings on the windows and door symbols I didn't recognize, but which filled me with an overwhelming sense of unease. I knew I had to leave before something worse happened. I drove out of Utah, my mind racing with the events of the past few days. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something had followed me from the ranch. Even now, as I sit in the safety of my home, I still feel its presence. The Skinwalker Ranch remains a place of mystery and terror, a reminder that some stories are better left untold. I will never forget my encounter with the Skinwalker, and I urge anyone who hears this tale to heed the warnings of those who know the truth. Some secrets are too dangerous to uncover, and some places are best left undisturbed. My name is Ryan, and I've always been a skeptic when it comes to the supernatural. I grew up in a small town in Arizona, surrounded by the legends and folklore of the Navajo people. Among these stories, the one that always fascinated and terrified me the most was that of the Skinwalker, a malevolent shapeshifter who could transform into any animal and wreak havoc on anyone who crossed its path. I had always dismissed these tales as just that, stories. But all that changed when I took a trip to the Navajo reservation to visit my friend Tom. Tom was Navajo, and he had grown up hearing the same stories I had. Unlike me, he took them seriously. He invited me to stay with him for a week, to show me the land and share his culture. I was eager to learn, but I had no idea what awaited me. The drive to the reservation was long and winding, the desert landscape stretching out for miles in every direction. I arrived at Tom's house in the late afternoon, greeted by the warm colors of the setting sun. Tom's family welcomed me with open arms, and we spent the evening sharing stories and laughter around a crackling fire. The first few days were uneventful, filled with hikes through the rugged terrain and visits to sacred sites. Tom told me about the history of his people, their struggles, and their resilience. It was a humbling experience, and I began to see the land through his eyes, a place of deep spiritual significance and power. On the fourth night, Tom suggested we camp out in the wilderness, far from any signs of civilization. He wanted to show me a place he rarely took outsiders, a secluded canyon said to be the home of the Skinwalker. I was hesitant, but my curiosity got the better of me. We packed our gear and set out just before dusk, the cool evening air a welcome relief from the scorching heat of the day. The hike was long and arduous, the path winding through narrow passages and over rocky outcrops. As we descended into the canyon, the light began to fade, casting long shadows on the walls. The air grew still, and an eerie silence settled over us. Tom seemed tense, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by a wary vigilance. We reached our campsite just as darkness fell, a small clearing surrounded by towering rock formations. Tom built a fire, and we sat in silence, the flickering flames casting strange shapes on the canyon walls. He handed me a cup of strong coffee and began to speak, his voice low and serious. "Ryan, I need you to listen carefully," he said. "This place, it's different. It's a place where the boundaries between our world and the spirit world are thin. You need to respect it, and you need to be prepared for anything." I nodded, feeling a chill run down my spine. Tom's words carried a weight I couldn't ignore. He continued, telling me about the Skinwalker and the ancient curse that bound it to this land. According to legend, the Skinwalker was once a powerful medicine man who had turned to dark magic, using his abilities to harm others. As punishment, he was cursed to roam the earth as a shapeshifter, forever trapped in a state of torment. Some say they can take on the form of any animal, Tom explained. Coyotes, wolves, birds, even humans. But they're not just shapeshifters. They can also control the minds of others, make them see things that aren't there. The fire crackled, and a distant howl echoed through the canyon. I felt a growing sense of unease, but I pushed it aside, reminding myself that I was a skeptic. We turned in for the night, lying on our sleeping bags beneath the star-studded sky. Despite my exhaustion, sleep eluded me. The sounds of the night seemed amplified, every rustle and whisper setting my nerves on edge. Sometime in the early hours of the morning, I heard a low, guttural growl coming from the darkness beyond the fire's light. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. Tom was already awake, his eyes fixed on the shadows. He motioned for me to stay quiet and reached for his rifle. The growling grew louder, more menacing, and I could see the outline of a large, hulking figure moving just beyond the fire's glow. It was like nothing I had ever seen before, its eyes glowing an unnatural red, its body covered in matted fur. It let out a bone-chilling howl, and I felt a wave of terror wash over me. Tom stood up, his voice steady, but filled with urgency. "Stay close to the fire, Ryan. Don't let it get to you." I did as he said, my eyes locked on the creature. It began to circle our camp, moving with an unnatural grace. The air grew colder, and I could feel its presence pressing down on me, a suffocating weight that made it hard to breathe. Tom started chanting in Navajo, his voice rising and falling in a rhythmic pattern. The creature paused, its eyes narrowing as if in recognition. It let out another howl, and I could see its form shifting, changing shape before my eyes. One moment it was a wolf, the next a coyote, then a large bird with black feathers. The chanting seemed to hold it at bay, but I could see the strain on Tom's face. He was fighting a battle I couldn't understand, and I felt helpless. The creature continued to shift and change, its movements growing more erratic and frenzied. Finally, with a final, blood-curdling scream, retreated into the darkness. The oppressive weight lifted, and I could breathe again. Tom collapsed to his knees, exhausted but relieved. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "We need to leave," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's not safe here." We quickly packed our gear and made our way out of the canyon, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon. As we hiked back, Tom explained that the Skinwalker had marked me, that it would not rest until it had taken me as its own. "You have to be careful, Ryan," he warned. "It will come for you, no matter where you go." I nodded, feeling a sense of dread settle over me. The events of the night had shattered my skepticism, and I knew I was in danger. We returned to Tom's house, and I decided to cut my trip short. I thanked him and his family for their hospitality and left the reservation, my mind racing with thoughts of the Skinwalker. In the weeks that followed, I tried to return to my normal life, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Strange things began to happen, objects moving on their own, shadows that seemed to shift and change shape. I started having nightmares, vivid and terrifying dreams of the creature hunting me. One night, I woke to find the Skinwalker standing at the foot of my bed, its glowing eyes boring into me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. It reached out with a clawed hand, and I felt a cold, burning sensation as it touched my skin. I woke up the next morning with a strange mark on my arm, a symbol I didn't recognize. I knew then that the curse was real, that the Skinwalker was bound to me. Desperate, I reached out to Tom, who urged me to seek the help of a Navajo medicine man. I traveled back to the reservation, meeting with an elderly shaman who performed a cleansing ceremony. He chanted and burned herbs, marking me with sacred symbols to protect me from the Skinwalker's influence. The ceremony was intense, and I felt a strange energy coursing through me. The nightmares lessened, and the strange occurrences stopped. But I knew the Skinwalker was still out there, waiting. The shaman warned me that the curse could never be fully broken, that I would always be marked. I returned home, determined to move on with my life. But the experience had changed me, and I could never forget the terror of that night in the canyon. The Skinwalker was real, and it had marked me in ways I couldn't fully understand. To this day, I remain vigilant, always aware of the shadows and the things that lurk just beyond the edge of the light. The curse of the Skinwalker is a reminder that some legends are rooted in truth, and some forces are too powerful to ignore. And no matter how far I run, I know it will always be with me, a dark presence that haunts my every step. My name is Elena, and I'm a wildlife photographer who has traveled to some of the most remote and wild places on Earth. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered on Skinwalker Ridge in New Mexico. It was supposed to be a routine trip to capture the beauty of the high desert. But it turned into a nightmare that still haunts me to this day. I arrived in New Mexico in late October, the air crisp and cool with the promise of winter. The landscape was stunning, with its rugged mountains and vast stretches of desert. I set up camp near the base of Skinwalker Ridge, an area known for its breathtaking views and rich wildlife. The locals, however, warned me about the ridge, saying it was cursed and that I should stay away. I dismissed their warnings as superstition, eager to capture the perfect shot. The first few days were uneventful, filled with long hikes and hours spent waiting for the right light. I saw plenty of wild leopard, coyotes, and even a few elusive mountain lions. But there was something about the ridge that felt off, an undercurrent of unease that I couldn't quite shake. One evening, as the sun was setting, I decided to explore a narrow canyon that cut through the ridge. The light was perfect, casting long shadows and turning the rocks a deep, fiery red. I followed the canyon deeper, captivated by its beauty. The air grew cooler as the shadows lengthened, and I realized I should head back to camp before it got too dark. As I turned to leave, I heard a strange noisy, low, guttural growl that echoed through the canyon. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I scanned the area, but saw nothing. The growl came again, louder and closer this time. My instincts told me to run, but my curiosity got the better of me. I moved slowly, my camera at the ready, following the sound. The canyon walls seemed to close in around me, the shadows deepening with each step. The growl grew louder, more menacing, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Then I saw a large, dark figure moving through the shadows. At first, I thought it was a bear, but as it came into view, I realized it was something else entirely. It stood on two legs, its body covered in matted fur. Its eyes glowed an unnatural red, and its teeth were long and sharp. It looked like a cross between a wolf and a man, a creature straight out of a nightmare. I snapped a few photos, my hands trembling. The creature let out a bone-chilling howl and started moving toward me. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my ears. The canyon seemed to twist and turn, and I struggled to find my way out. I could hear the creature behind me, its growls growing louder and more frenzied. I finally burst out of the canyon and into the open desert, the sky now a deep shade of purple. I ran toward my camp, not daring to look back. I could still hear the creature's howls echoing through the night. I reached my tent and grabbed my car keys, jumping into my vehicle and driving away as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, my mind racing with what I had seen. I found a small motel and checked in, locking the door and drawing the curtains tight. I spent the night wide awake, my camera clutched in my hands. I reviewed the photos I had taken, but they were all blurry and indistinct. The creature was just a shadow, a dark blur against the canyon walls. The next morning, I went to the local library to research the area. I found old newspaper articles and books about Skinwalker Ridge, all filled with stories of strange sightings and unexplained phenomena. The locals believed the ridge was home to Skinwalker several shapeshifters. From Navajo legend who could transform into animals and cause harm to anyone who crossed their path. I decided to visit the Navajo reservation nearby, hoping to find someone who could help me understand what I had seen. I met with an elder named Thomas, who listened to my story with a grave expression. He told me about the Skinwalkers, how they were once powerful medicine men, who had turned to dark magic, using their abilities to harm others. As punishment, they were cursed to roam the earth as shapeshifters, forever trapped in a state of torment. Thomas warned me that the Skinwalker I had encountered would not rest until it had taken what it wanted. He performed a cleansing ceremony, marking me with sacred symbols and burning herbs to protect me from the creature's influence. I felt a strange energy wash over me, a sense of calm and clarity that I hadn't felt since the encounter. I returned to the ridge one last time, determined to confront my fear and capture the truth. Armed with Thomas's protection, I hiked back to the canyon, my camera ready. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the desert. I reached the canyon and waited, my heart pounding in my chest. As darkness fell, I heard the growl again. The creature emerged from the shadows, its red eyes glowing in the night. But this time, I didn't run. I stood my ground, chanting the words Thomas had taught me. The creature paused, its eyes narrowing. It let out a howl, but it seemed weak, less menacing. I raised my camera and took a series of photos, capturing the creature in the dim light. It let out one final growl and retreated into the shadows, disappearing into the darkness. I felt a sense of relief wash over me, knowing that I had faced my fear and come out stronger. I returned to my camp, packing up my gear and leaving the ridge behind. The photos I had taken were clear and unmistakably proof of the creature's existence. I published my story and the photos, hoping to share the truth with the world. The encounter changed me in ways I couldn't have imagined. I no longer dismiss the stories and legends of the supernatural. There are forces in this world that we cannot explain, creatures that lurk in the shadows, waiting to be discovered. And I, for one, will never forget the night I faced the Skinwalker at Skinwalker Ridge. My name is Jason, and I'm an avid hiker and nature enthusiast. I've trekked through many trails across the United States, experiencing the breathtaking beauty and raw power of the wilderness. However, none of my adventures compared to what I encountered on the Navajo Trail in Utah. This story is a haunting reminder of the supernatural forces that lurk in the shadows, and it is one that I will never forget. The Navajo Trail is a popular hiking route located in Bryce Canyon National Park. Known for its stunning rock formations and panoramic views, it attracts thousands of visitors each year. My friend Alex and I decided to explore the trail during the off-season, hoping to avoid the crowds and capture some incredible photographs. We set off early in the morning, the sun just beginning to rise over the horizon. The air was crisp and cool, and the sky was a brilliant shade of blue. We followed the winding path through the canyon, marveling at the towering hoodoos and the vibrant colors of the rock. It was a perfect day for hiking, and we felt a sense of excitement and adventure. As we ventured deeper into the canyon, the trail became more challenging. The narrow path twisted and turned, leading us through steep descents and rocky terrain. We paused frequently to catch our breath and take in the scenery. The silence of the canyon broken only by the occasional call of a bird or the rustle of leaves in the wind. By mid-afternoon, we had reached a remote section of the trail, far from the main tourist areas. The landscape was desolate and eerie, with twisted trees and jagged rocks casting long shadows on the ground. There was a sense of isolation and foreboding that hung in the air, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We decided to set up camp for the night, finding a flat area near a small stream. As we gathered wood for a fire, Alex began to share some of the local legends he had read about. He spoke of the Navajo people and their belief in Skinwalker's malevolent shapeshifters who could take on the form of any animal or person. According to legend, Skinwalkers were once powerful medicine men who had turned to dark magic, using their abilities to harm others. I listened with a mixture of fascination and skepticism, dismissing the stories as mere folklore. But as the sun began to set and the shadows grew longer, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. The canyon seemed to come alive with strange sounds and whispers, the wind carrying an ominous message. We built a fire and cooked a simple meal, the flickering flames providing some comfort against the encroaching darkness. As night fell, the temperature dropped, and we huddled close to the fire, sharing stories and laughter. But the sense of unease remained, a constant presence that gnawed at the edges of my mind. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. We crawled into our sleeping bags, the warmth of the fire fading as the cold night air settled in. I lay awake, staring up at the star-studded sky, my mind racing with thoughts of skinwalkers and the supernatural. Just as I was starting to drift off, I heard a low, guttural growl coming from the darkness beyond the fire's light. My heart skipped a beat, and I sat up, straining to see through the inky blackness. The growl came again, louder and more menacing. I nudged Alex, who woke with a start. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Alex nodded, his eyes wide with fear. We grabbed our flashlights and shone them into the darkness, the beams cutting through the night. At first, we saw nothing, but then we caught a glimpse of Mokele-Mbembe, a large, shadowy figure lurking just beyond the edge of the light. It was difficult to make out any details, but the figure was tall and hunched, with glowing eyes that pierced the darkness. It let out another growl, and we could see its form shifting and changing, as if it were made of shadows. My mind raced with fear and disbelief. Could it be a skinwalker? We stood frozen, our flashlights trembling in our hands. The creature moved closer, its eyes locked on us. Alex began to chant softly in Navajo, repeating words I didn't understand. The creature paused, its eyes narrowing. It let out a howl, a sound that echoed through the canyon and sent shivers down my spine. Suddenly, the fire flared up, casting a brilliant light across the campsite. The creature recoiled, its form flickering and distorting. It let out one final growl before retreating into the darkness, disappearing from sight. The air grew still, and the oppressive weight lifted. Alex turned to me, his face pale and drawn. "We need to leave," he said urgently. "Now." We quickly packed our gear, the adrenaline pumping through our veins. The sense of urgency was palpable, and we knew we couldn't stay another night in the canyon. We hiked through the night, the darkness pressing in around us. Every rustle and shadow seemed to take on a sinister significance, and we moved as quickly as we could. As dawn broke, we finally emerged from the canyon, exhausted but relieved. We drove back to the nearest town, our minds reeling from the night's events. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see the creature lurking in the shadows. We decided to visit the local Navajo reservation, seeking answers and protection. We met with an elder named Mary, who listened to our story with a grave expression. She told us that the creature we had encountered was indeed a skinwalker, a powerful and dangerous entity. Mary performed a cleansing ceremony, using sage and sacred symbols to protect us from the skinwalker's influence. The ceremony was intense, and I felt a strange energy coursing through me, a sense of clarity and calm that I hadn't felt in days. She warned us that the skinwalker would not easily forget us, that it would seek us out if we weren't careful. "You must respect the land and the spirits that dwell within it," she said. "Only then will you find peace." We thanked her and returned home, our minds forever changed by the experience. The encounter had shattered my skepticism, and I no longer dismissed the stories and legends of the supernatural. There are forces in this world that we cannot explain, creatures that lurk in the shadows, waiting to be discovered. To this day, I remain vigilant, always aware of the things that go bump in the night. The encounter at Navajo Trail is a haunting reminder that some legends are rooted in truth, and some forces are too powerful to ignore. And no matter where I go, I will always carry the memory of that night in the canyon, when I came face to face with the skinwalker. My name is Michael, and I used to be an avid camper and hiker. The wilderness was my sanctuary, a place where I could escape the hustle and bustle of city life and reconnect with nature. But a camping trip in the remote forests of Canada changed my life forever. This is the story of my encounter with the Wendigo, a creature of legend and terror that still haunts my dreams. It was late autumn when my friends, Sarah and Daniel, and I decided to take a week-long camping trip in the boreal forest. We were seasoned campers, well prepared for the harsh conditions and excited to explore the pristine wilderness. We had heard rumors of strange occurrences in the area, but we dismissed them as mere stories meant to scare tourists. We set up camp near a serene lake, the water so clear you could see the pebbles at the bottom. The forest was dense and ancient, the trees towering above us like silent guardians. We spent the first few days hiking, fishing, and enjoying the beauty of the untouched landscape. The air was crisp and clean, and the nights were cold but peaceful, the silence only broken by the occasional howl of a distant wolf. On the fourth night, we decided to venture deeper into the forest, hoping to find a hidden waterfall that Daniel had read about. We packed our gear and set off early in the morning, following a narrow trail that wound through the trees. The further we went, the denser the forest became, the shadows growing longer and the air colder. By late afternoon, we had lost the trail. We were in the heart of the forest, surrounded by towering pines and thick underbrush. The light was fading, and a sense of unease settled over us. We decided to set up camp for the night and resume our search in the morning. As darkness fell, we built a fire and huddled around it, the warmth a welcome relief from the biting cold. We shared stories and laughter, trying to keep our spirits up despite the growing sense of isolation. But as the night wore on, an eerie silence descended upon the forest. The usual sounds of wildlife were absent, replaced by an oppressive stillness. Suddenly, we heard a distant cry, a sound unlike anything I had ever heard before. It was a long, mournful wail, filled with pain and despair. It sent shivers down my spine, and I could see the fear in my friend's eyes. "What was that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Daniel replied, his face pale. "But it didn't sound like any animal I've ever heard." We listened intently, but the cry did not come again. We tried to shake off the fear and went to bed, but sleep did not come easily. I lay awake, staring at the dark canopy above, my mind racing with thoughts of the strange cry. In the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a loud Nerzia tree branch snapping nearby. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear something moving through the underbrush, something large and heavy. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the darkness, but saw nothing. I woke Sarah and Daniel, and we huddled together, listening to the sounds of movement. The creature seemed to circle our camp, its footsteps heavy and deliberate. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath misting in the light of the flashlight. Then we saw it, a tall, gaunt figure standing at the edge of the firelight. It was humanoid in shape, but emaciated, its skin stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and its mouth was filled with sharp, jagged teeth. The creature let out a low growl, a sound filled with hunger and malice. "It's a Wendigo," Daniel whispered, his voice filled with terror. "We have to get out of here." We grabbed our gear and doused the fire, moving as quickly and quietly as we could. The creature followed us, its glowing eyes watching our every move. We could hear its heavy breathing and the crunch of leaves under its feet as it stalked us through the forest. We ran through the night, our fear driving us forward. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees like dark sentinels. The Wendigo's cries echoed through the night, a chilling reminder that we were being hunted. As dawn broke, we reached the edge of the forest and stumbled into a clearing. We could see the lake in the distance, a glimmer of hope in the bleak landscape. But the Wendigo was still behind us, relentless in its pursuit. We ran to the lake and climbed into our canoe, paddling furiously across the water. The creature stood on the shore, watching us with its glowing eyes. It let out one final, mournful wail before retreating into the forest. We reached the other side of the lake and collapsed on the shore, exhausted and terrified. We packed up our camp and drove back to the nearest town, our minds reeling from the encounter. We visited a local elder who confirmed our worst fears. The creature we had encountered was indeed a Wendigo, a spirit of hunger and cannibalism from Algonquian folklore. It was said to possess those who had committed acts of cannibalism, transforming them into monstrous beings, driven by an insatiable hunger for human flesh. The elder performed a cleansing ceremony, using sage and sacred symbols to protect us from the Wendigo's influence. But he warned us that the creature would not easily forget us, that it would seek us out if we weren't careful. We returned home, our lives forever changed by the encounter. The wilderness, once a place of solace and beauty, now held a sinister darkness. The memory of the Wendigo's glowing eyes and mournful wails haunted my dreams, a constant reminder of the supernatural forces that lurk in the shadows. To this day, I remain vigilant, always aware of the things that go bump in the night. The encounter in the boreal forest is a haunting reminder that some legends are rooted in truth, and some forces are too powerful to ignore. And no matter where I go, I will always carry the memory of that night in the forest, when I came face to face with the Wendigo. My name is Jenna, and I'm a photographer with a passion for capturing the untouched beauty of nature. I've traveled to many remote locations, seeking to document the landscapes that few people ever see. But my trip to Red Mesa in New Mexico led to an encounter with a skinwalker that I will never forget. Red Mesa is a rugged and remote area, known for its dramatic cliffs and expansive views. It is also steeped in Navajo folklore, with many tales of supernatural occurrences and creatures that roam the night. I had heard these stories, but like many, I dismissed them as mere legends. My friend Luke and I decided to spend a week exploring and photographing the area. We packed our gear and set off, excited to see what the mesa had to offer. The journey was long and arduous, the roads rough and unpaved, but we finally arrived at our destination. We set up camp at the base of the mesa, the towering cliffs casting long shadows over our sight. The first few days were uneventful, filled with breathtaking views and perfect photo opportunities. We hiked, climbed, and explored, reveling in the solitude and beauty of the landscape. On the fourth night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, we decided to venture to a nearby cave that Luke had read about. It was said to be a sacred place, used by the Navajo for ceremonies and rituals. We hoped to capture some unique photographs of the ancient rock art rumored to be inside. The cave was located high up on the mesa, accessible only by a narrow and treacherous path. We climbed carefully, the darkness deepening with each step. By the time we reached the cave, the stars were out, and the moon cast an eerie glow over the landscape. We entered the cave, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The air was cool and still, and the walls were covered in intricate carvings and paintings. It was a hauntingly beautiful place, filled with a sense of history and mystery. As we explored, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I glanced at Luke, who seemed equally uneasy. "Let's get our shots and head back," I whispered, my voice echoing off the cave walls. Luke nodded, and we quickly set up our cameras, capturing the ancient artwork. But as we worked, we heard a low, guttural growl coming from the entrance of the cave. We froze, our eyes widening in fear. Slowly, we turned our flashlights towards the entrance, and what we saw made our blood run cold. Standing there was a creature, tall and gaunt, with glowing red eyes and long, matted hair. Its skin was a sickly gray, and its mouth was filled with sharp, jagged teeth. "It's a skinwalker," Luke whispered, his voice trembling. The creature let out another growl and stepped closer, its eyes locked on us. We backed away, our flashlights trembling in our hands. The cave seemed to close in around us, the darkness pressing in from all sides. "We need to get out of here," I said urgently, my heart pounding in my chest. We grabbed our gear and slowly made our way towards the entrance, never taking our eyes off the Skinwalker. It followed our every move, its eyes glowing with a malevolent intelligence. Just as we reached the entrance, it lunged at us, letting out a terrifying scream. We bolted down the narrow path, the creature close behind. The descent was treacherous, and we stumbled and fell multiple times, the rocks cutting into our skin. The Skinwalker was relentless, its growls echoing through the night. We finally reached the base of the mesa and ran to our camp, diving into the safety of our tent. We could hear the creature circling outside, its growls growing louder and more menacing. The tent offered little protection, and we huddled together, praying for dawn to come. The night seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness filled with the Skinwalker's cries. We didn't dare move, fearing that any noise would draw it closer. As the first light of dawn began to break, the growls finally ceased, and an eerie silence fell over the camp. We cautiously emerged from the tent, our bodies aching and our minds reeling from the night's events. The Skinwalker was gone, but the sense of dread remained. We quickly packed up our camp and left the mesa, our spirits broken and our hearts heavy with fear. We drove to the nearest town and sought out a Navajo elder, hoping to find answers and protection. The elder listened to our story with a grave expression and performed a cleansing ceremony, using sage and sacred symbols to protect us from the Skinwalker's influence. He warned us that the Skinwalker was a powerful and dangerous entity, one that would not easily forget us. "You must respect the land and the spirits that dwell within it," he said. "Only then will you find peace." We thanked him and returned home, our lives forever changed by the encounter. The wilderness, once a place of solace and beauty, now held a sinister darkness. The memory of the Skinwalker's glowing eyes and terrifying growls haunted my dreams, a constant reminder of the supernatural forces that lurk in the shadows. To this day, I remain vigilant, always aware of the things that go bump in the night. The encounter at Red Mesa is a haunting reminder that some legends are rooted in truth, and some forces are too powerful to ignore. And no matter where I go, I will always carry the memory of that night in the cave, when I came face to face with the Skinwalker. My name is Ethan, and I am a journalist who has always had a keen interest in the unexplained. Over the years, I've covered numerous stories about mysterious creatures and paranormal events. However, one assignment in the backwoods of Michigan changed my life forever. This is the story of my encounter with the Dogman. I first heard about the Dogman while working on a piece about cryptids in North America. The legends of a half-man, half-dog creature roaming the forests of Michigan had been around for centuries, with numerous sightings reported over the years. Intrigued, I decided to investigate further and see if there was any truth to these tales. My journey took me to a small town near the Manistee National Forest. The locals were hesitant to talk about the Dogman, their fear and superstition palpable. However, I managed to convince a few to share their stories, and the accounts were chilling. People spoke of a creature standing over 7 feet tall, with the body of a man and the head of a wolf. Its eyes glowed an eerie yellow, and its howl could freeze the blood in your veins. Armed with my camera and recording equipment, I decided to spend a few nights in the forest, hoping to capture evidence of the Dogman's existence. I set up camp in a remote area, far from any human habitation. The forest was dense and dark, the towering trees blocking out most of the sunlight. At night, the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant calls of nocturnal animals. On the third night, as I was reviewing my notes by the campfire, I heard a low growl coming from the darkness. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly turned on my flashlight, scanning the forest. The beam of light revealed nothing but shadows and trees. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease and continued my work. A few minutes later, the growl came again, louder and closer this time. I stood up, my flashlight in one hand and my camera in the other. The air grew colder, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. Suddenly, I saw a pair of glowing yellow eyes staring at me from the darkness. They were high off the ground, at least 7 feet up, and filled with an intelligence that sent shivers down my spine. I raised my camera and snapped a few pictures, but the creature moved too quickly. It stepped into the light of the campfire, and I finally saw it clearly. The Dogman was a terrifying sight, its muscular body covered in dark fur, and its head unmistakably that of a wolf. It let out a howl that echoed through the forest, a sound that seemed to vibrate in my very bones. I backed away slowly, my mind racing with fear and disbelief. The Dogman took a step towards me, its eyes never leaving mine. I could see the hunger and aggression in its gaze, and I knew that I was in grave danger. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest, the sound of the Dogman's pursuit close behind. I stumbled through the forest, branches whipping against my face and tearing at my clothes. The creature was relentless, its heavy footsteps growing louder with each passing second. I could hear its growls, a terrifying reminder that it was gaining on me. Just as I thought I could run no further, saw a light in the distance. It was a cabin, a small and humble structure, with smoke rising from the chimney. I sprinted towards it, praying that whoever was inside would help me. I burst through the door, gasping for breath, and slammed it shut behind me. An elderly man stood in the middle of the room, his expression one of shock and concern. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "Dogman," I managed to say between gasps. "It's chasing me." The man's face grew grim, and he grabbed a shotgun from the wall. "Stay here," he ordered, moving towards the door. Before I could protest, the door was thrown open, and the Dogman lunged into the cabin. The old man fired a shot, the sound deafening in the small space. The creature let out a roar of pain and rage, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it attacked with renewed ferocity, its claws slashing through the air. The man fought bravely, his movements quick and determined despite his age. He managed to drive the Dogman back, but it was clear that he was no match for the creature's strength and speed. Just as the Dogman was about to deliver a fatal blow, I grabbed a heavy iron poker from the fireplace and swung it with all my might. The blow struck the Dogman on the head, and it staggered, its eyes losing focus for a moment. The old man seized the opportunity and fired another shot, this time hitting the creature square in the chest. The creature lay motionless, its once fearsome form now just a lifeless heap of fur and muscle. The old man lowered his shotgun and turned to me, his face pale but resolute. "You were lucky," he said quietly. "The Dogman doesn't usually give up so easily." I nodded, still in shock from the encounter. "Thank you," I managed to say. "You saved my life." He waved away my gratitude. "Just be glad you're alive. Not many are so fortunate when they come face to face with the Dogman." We buried the creature deep in the forest, hoping that its death would bring an end to the terror it had caused. The old men warned me not to speak of what had happened, but I knew that the story needed to be told. People needed to know that the legends were true, and that the Dogman was real. I left the forest the next morning, my mind reeling from the events of the previous night. The encounter with the Dogman had shaken me to my core, challenging everything I thought I knew about the world. The wilderness, once a place of wonder and beauty, now held a sinister darkness that I couldn't ignore. To this day, the memory of those glowing yellow eyes and that terrifying howl haunts my dreams. The encounter in the backwoods of Michigan is a haunting reminder that some legends are rooted in truth, and that some forces are too powerful to ignore. And no matter where I go, I will always carry the memory of that night, when I came face to face with the Dogman. My name is Laura Westcott, and I am a wildlife photographer. For the past 15 years, I have traveled across North America, capturing the beauty and majesty of the continent's diverse wildlife. My work has taken me to some of the most remote and breathtaking locations. but none has left an impression as profound as the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest. It was the summer of 2015, and I had been commissioned by a nature magazine to photograph the region's avian species. The Pacific Northwest is known for its rich bird life, and I was excited to add some new and rare shots to my portfolio. Little did I know that this trip would be unlike any other. I arrived in a small town nestled at the edge of the Olympic National Forest, a vast, ancient woodland that stretches for miles. The locals were friendly and eager to share their knowledge of the area. One evening, while chatting with an elderly man at the local diner, I heard whispers of an old legend, the Thunderbird. The man, who introduced himself as Joe, told me that the Thunderbird was a mythical creature revered by the indigenous tribes of the region. According to the legend, the Thunderbird was a giant bird with the power to create storms and lightning with its wings. Joe mentioned that there had been recent sightings of an enormous bird in the forest, and some believed the Thunderbird had returned. I was skeptical, but intrigued. As a photographer, I had encountered my share of local legends and folklore, but I had never seen anything to suggest they were real. Nevertheless, the idea of capturing a mythical creature on film was too tempting to resist. I decided to set up camp deep in the forest, away from the well-trodden paths. I hoped to capture some unique shots of the area's wildlife and perhaps catch a glimpse of the legendary Thunderbird. My first few days were uneventful, filled with the usual birds and animals one might expect to find in such a place. On the fourth day, as the sun began to set, I noticed a change in the atmosphere. The forest grew eerily quiet, and the air felt charged with electricity. I set up my camera, hoping to capture the approaching storm. As I scanned the sky, I spied a massive shadow swooping through the clouds, moving with incredible speed and grace. My heart raced as I focused my lens, trying to track the shadow. Lightning flashed, illuminating the sky for a brief moment. And I saw it clearly, a bird of enormous size, with wings that seemed to span the horizon. It was unlike anything I had ever seen, and I knew I was looking at the Thunderbird. I snapped as many photos as I could, my hands shaking with excitement and fear. The Thunderbird circled above, its presence commanding and awe-inspiring. It let out a deafening screech that echoed through the forest, sending shivers down my spine. Just as quickly as it had appeared, the Thunderbird vanished into the storm clouds, leaving me breathless and bewildered. I reviewed the photos on my camera, and to my amazement, I had captured several clear shots of the creature. I knew I had something truly extraordinary. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing with questions and possibilities. Was the Thunderbird real, or had I witnessed something else entirely? The legend spoke of its power to control the weather, and the storm that had accompanied its appearance seemed to lend credence to the tales. The next morning, I packed up my gear and headed back to town. I was eager to share my findings and get some answers. I showed the photos to Joe and a few other locals, and their reactions were a mix of astonishment and fear. They confirmed that the bird in my photos matched the descriptions of the Thunderbird from their stories. Word of my encounter spread quickly, and soon, the town was buzzing with excitement. Researchers and cryptozoologists arrived, hoping to study the phenomenon. The forest became a hub of activity as people searched for more evidence of the Thunderbird's existence. As the days went by, I continued to explore the forest, documenting the wildlife and the changes in the environment. I noticed that the presence of the Thunderbird seemed to affect the behavior of the animals. They were more cautious, and the usual sounds of the forest were subdued, as if they were aware of the powerful creature that now shared their home. One evening, I decided to venture further into the forest, following a path that led to a secluded clearing. As I walked, I felt a sense of anticipation, as if something significant was about to happen. The sky grew dark, and a storm began to brew, much like the one from before. I set up my camera and waited, hoping for another encounter. The wind picked up, and the trees swayed violently. Lightning flashed, and thunder rumbled in the distance. Then, out of the darkness, the Thunderbird appeared once more. This time, it was closer, and I could see the intricate details of its feathers and the intensity in its eyes. It hovered above the clearing, its wings creating gusts of wind that whipped through the trees. I took several more photos, each one capturing the majesty and power of the creature. As I watched, the thunderbird seemed to acknowledge my presence. It let out a low resonant call that reverberated through the air. In that moment, I felt a connection to the creature, a sense of mutual respect and understanding. The storm intensified, and the thunderbird ascended into the clouds, disappearing from sight. I stood there, soaked from the rain, feeling a mix of exhilaration and reverence. I knew I had witnessed something truly extraordinary, something that would stay with me for the rest of my life. I returned to town with my new photos and shared them with the researchers. They were astounded by the clarity and detail, and the evidence sparked renewed interest in the legend of the thunderbird. My photos were published in several magazines, and the story of the thunderbird became a topic of fascination and debate. Despite the attention and acclaim, I remained humble about my experience. The thunderbird was more than just a subject for my camera. It was a reminder of the mysteries that still exist in our world. Mysteries that defy explanation and challenge our understanding of nature. I continue to travel and photograph wildlife, always with an eye out for the extraordinary. The encounter with the thunderbird taught me to keep an open mind and to respect the natural world and its wonders. There are still many stories to be told and many secrets to uncover, and I am grateful to be a part of that journey. My name is Ethan Thomas, and I'm an investigative journalist. Over the years, I've covered everything from political scandals to unsolved crimes. But nothing could have prepared me for the story I stumbled upon in the deserts of New Mexico. It was the spring of 2018, and I had been assigned to write an article about Native American folklore and its impact on modern culture. My research led me to the Navajo Nation, where I hoped to learn more about the mysterious figure known as the Skinwalker. The Skinwalker, or Ye-Nald-Lushii, is a shape-shifting witch from Navajo legend. According to the stories, skinwalkers are evil beings who can transform into animals and possess other creatures. They are feared and reviled, often blamed for unexplained deaths, illnesses, and disappearances. I had heard whispers of skinwalker encounters before, but I was skeptical. As a journalist, I needed facts, evidence, and first-hand accounts. I arrived in the small town of Shiprock, nestled near the sacred Shiprock Pinnacle, a towering rock formation that holds great significance to the Navajo people. The locals were wary of outsiders, especially when it came to discussing the Skinwalker. However, I managed to arrange a meeting with a Navajo elder named Tahoma. He agreed to share his knowledge and experiences with me, but only after I assured him that I would approach the subject with respect and sensitivity. We met at his modest home, surrounded by the vast, arid landscape of the desert. Tahoma was a stoic man in his 70s, with weathered skin and piercing eyes that seemed to hold centuries of wisdom. He welcomed me with the traditional greeting and offered me tea. After some small talk, I asked him about the Skinwalker. Tahoma sighed deeply, as if the weight of the topic was almost too much to bear. He began to speak in a low, measured tone, recounting the history and lore of the Skinwalker. According to him, Skinwalkers were once powerful medicine men and women who had turned to dark magic. They used their abilities to harm others and could assume the form of any animal they desired. The stories were chilling, filled with accounts of mysterious deaths, strange sightings, and inexplicable phenomena. As he spoke, I noticed a shift in his demeanor. His eyes grew darker, and his voice took on a more urgent tone. He told me that the Skinwalkers were not just legends, they were real, and their presence still haunted the Navajo people. He warned me to be careful, as seeking out the Skinwalker could invite danger. Despite his warnings, I was determined to learn more. I asked Tahoma if he had ever encountered a Skinwalker himself. He hesitated for a moment before nodding slowly. He told me about an incident that had occurred many years ago, when he was a young man. Tahoma and his friend, Akacheta, had been out hunting in the desert. It was a clear night, and the full moon cast an eerie glow over the landscape. As they tracked a deer, they noticed strange footprints in the sand, footprints that seemed to change shape with each step. At first, they thought it was an injured animal, but as they followed the tracks, they realized they were dealing with something far more sinister. The tracks led them to a remote canyon, where they saw a figure standing in the shadows. It was tall and gaunt, with eyes that glowed like embers. As they approached, the figure let out a bone-chilling howl and transformed into a coyote before their eyes. The coyote darted towards them, and Tahoma and Akacheta barely managed to escape. That night, they returned to their village and told the elders what had happened. The elders performed a cleansing ceremony to protect them from the Skinwalker's curse, but the encounter left a lasting mark on Tahoma. He told me that the memory of those glowing eyes still haunted his dreams. I left Tahoma's home with a sense of unease, but also burning curiosity. I decided to stay in Shiprock for a few more days, hoping to find more leads. I spoke with several locals, but most were reluctant to discuss the Skinwalker. Some dismissed it as superstition, while others warned me to drop the subject for my own safety. On my third day in town, I met a woman named Eliza, who claimed to have had her own encounter with the Skinwalker. Eliza was a nurse at the local clinic, and she had a reputation for being level-headed and pragmatic. She agreed to meet me at a diner on the outskirts of town. Over coffee, Eliza recounted her experience. It had happened a year earlier, while she was driving home late at night. She was on a deserted road when she saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. She slowed down, thinking it was a hitchhiker, but as she got closer, she realized it was something else entirely. The figure was a tall, emaciated man, with glowing red eyes and long, matted hair. His skin was gray and leathery, and he wore tattered clothes. Eliza said she felt a wave of terror wash over her, and she instinctively locked her doors. The figure approached her car, and she could see his eyes burning with an unnatural intensity. Eliza tried to reverse, but her car wouldn't start. She was trapped. The figure reached out and placed a hand on her window, and she felt an icy chill spread through the glass. She closed her eyes and began to pray, and after what felt like an eternity, the figure let out a guttural growl and vanished into the night. Eliza's car started again, and she drove home as fast as she could. She told me that the encounter had shaken her to her core, and she had since become deeply involved in her community's efforts to ward off the Skinwalkers. As I listened to her story, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. The accounts were too consistent, too vivid to be mere fabrications. I decided to visit the canyon that Tahoma had mentioned, hoping to find some evidence of the Skinwalker's presence. I drove out to the desert the next day, following the directions Tahoma had given me. The canyon was remote and desolate, with jagged rocks and sparse vegetation. I parked my car and began to explore, my camera and notebook at the ready. As I walked, I felt a growing sense of unease. The air was heavy, and the silence was oppressive. I found the strange footprints that Tahoma had described, and I followed them deeper into the canyon. The tracks were erratic, changing shape and size with each step. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the canyon. I was about to turn back when I heard a low growl. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure emerge from the shadows, a tall, gaunt man with glowing eyes. The Skinwalker. I fumbled for my camera, but my hands were shaking so badly that I dropped it. The Skinwalker moved closer, its eyes burning with malevolence. I could feel its presence, like a physical weight, pressing down on me. Desperation took over, and I remembered Tahoma's advice. I began to chant a prayer I had learned from the locals, hoping it would offer some protection. The Skinwalker paused, its expression changing from anger to confusion. It let out a piercing scream and transformed into a coyote, darting away into the darkness. I didn't wait to see where it went. I grabbed my camera and ran back to my car, my heart racing. I drove back to town, my mind reeling from the encounter. I knew I had been lucky to escape, and I vowed never to underestimate the power of the legends again. I shared my story with Tahoma and Eliza, and they both confirmed that I had encountered a skinwalker. They performed a cleansing ritual to protect me from any lingering effects of the encounter. The experience left me shaken, but it also deepened my respect for the Navajo culture and their beliefs. I returned home and wrote my article, sharing the stories and encounters I had gathered. The response was overwhelming, with readers fascinated by the legends and the possibility of the skinwalker's existence. While many remained skeptical, others were intrigued by the idea that there are still mysteries in our world that defy explanation. To this day, I carry the memory of that encounter with me. It serves as a reminder that some legends are more than just stories. They are a testament to the unknown, to the forces that exist beyond our understanding. And as long as we respect those forces, we can coexist with the mysteries that make our world so extraordinary. My name is Charles Blake, and I'm an author specializing in folklore and ghost stories. My work has taken me to many eerie and remote places, but none have been as haunting as the coastal town of Cromer, England. I had come to Cromer to research Black Shuck, a legendary spectral hound. That had been the subject of countless tales and sightings over the centuries. It was the fall of 2016 when I arrived in Cromer, a quaint town perched on the edge of the North Sea. The air was crisp, and the waves crashed against the rocky shore, creating an atmosphere that seemed ripe for ghostly encounters. The legend of Black Shuck, a giant black dog with glowing red eyes, had fascinated me for years. According to local lore, the appearance of Black Shuck was a harbinger of death and disaster. I checked into a small bed and breakfast run by an elderly woman named Mrs. Havisham. She was a friendly and chatty host, eager to share her knowledge of the town's history and legends. Over a cup of tea, I mentioned my interest in Black Shuck, and her expression grew serious. "Ah, Black Shuck," she said, her voice tinged with a mix of reverence and fear. "Many have seen the beast, but few live to tell the tale. Be careful, Mr. Blake. Some things are better left undisturbed." Her warning only fueled my curiosity. I spent my first few days in Cromer exploring the town and its surroundings, talking to locals and gathering stories about Black Shuck. The tales were varied, but they all shared common elements. A massive black dog, with eyes that glowed like embers, appearing suddenly and vanishing just as quickly. One evening, I visited the ruins of St. Peter's Church, a crumbling structure said to be a hotspot for Black Shuck sightings. The church stood on a hill overlooking the sea, its stone walls weathered by centuries of wind and salt. As I walked among the gravestones, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground. I had brought my camera and a voice recorder, hoping to capture any evidence of the supernatural. The air grew colder, and a dense fog began to roll in from the sea, shrouding the ruins in an eerie mist. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I pressed on, determined to document my findings. As I reached the far end of the churchyard, I heard a low growl. I turned, my heart pounding, and saw a pair of glowing red eyes staring at me from the shadows. My breath caught in my throat as the figure of a massive black dog emerged from the fog. It was Black Shuck, exactly as the legends described. I fumbled for my camera, but my hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold it steady. The dog growled again, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground. Its eyes burned with an intensity that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. Suddenly, the dog lunged at me, and I stumbled backward, dropping my camera. I hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of me. When I looked up, Black Shuck was gone, and the fog had lifted, leaving the churchyard eerily silent. I scrambled to my feet and retrieved my camera, my hands still trembling. I had managed to take a few photos, but they were blurry and indistinct. Frustrated, I made my way back to the bed and breakfast, my mind racing with thoughts of what I had just experienced. That night, I reviewed the recordings on my voice recorder, hoping to find some evidence of Black Shuck's presence. To my surprise, I heard the growls and the sound of my own terrified breathing. But there was something else, a low, haunting whisper that sent shivers down my spine. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The next morning, I showed the photos and recordings to Mrs. Havisham. She listened intently, her expression grave. "You have encountered Black Shuck, Mr. Blake," she said softly. "The beast is real, and it carries a curse. Be careful, for it is said that those who see Black Shuck are marked for death." Her words echoed in my mind as I continued my research. I spoke with more locals, each with their own tales of encounters with the spectral hound. Some described losing loved ones shortly after seeing Black Shuck, while others spoke of mysterious accidents and illnesses. One story stood out to me, tale told by a fisherman named Tom. He had seen Black Shuck one stormy night while out at sea. The dog had appeared on the deck of his boat, its eyes glowing fiercely. Tom had barely escaped with his life, and shortly after, deadly storm had capsized several boats in the harbor, claiming many lives. Determined to uncover the truth, I decided to visit the site of another famous Black Shuck sighting, ruins of a medieval monastery located a few miles outside of town. The monastery had been abandoned for centuries, its stone walls crumbling and overgrown with ivy. I arrived at the ruins just before dusk, my camera and recorder ready. The atmosphere was oppressive, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. As I explored the ruins, I felt a growing sense of unease, as if I were being watched. Suddenly, I heard a rustling sound behind me. I turned and saw a shadowy figure darting among the trees. My heart raced as I followed the figure, my curiosity overcoming my fear. The figure led me deeper into the woods, where the trees grew thicker and the light dimmer. I emerged into a small clearing, and there, standing in the center, was Black Shuck. The dog was even larger than I remembered, its eyes burning with an otherworldly fire. It stood perfectly still, watching me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I raised my camera, but before I could take a photo, Black Shuck lunged at me. I felt a searing pain in my leg as its teeth sank into my flesh. I screamed and fell to the ground, my vision blurring as I struggled to stay conscious. When I awoke, I was back at the bed and breakfast, my leg bandaged and my head throbbing. Mrs. Havisham sat by my bedside, her expression a mix of concern and relief. "You were found in the woods," she explained. "A hiker heard your screams and brought you here." I told her about the attack, and she shook her head sadly. "Black Shuck has marked you, Mr. Blake. You must leave Cromer at once. The curse is real, and it will follow you if you stay." Reluctantly, I took her advice and left Cromer the next day. As I drove away from the town, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The events of the past few days had shaken me to my core, and I knew that my life would never be the same. Back home, I wrote about my experiences, sharing the chilling details of my encounters with Black Shuck. The article was well received, and it sparked renewed interest in the legend of the spectral hound. But for me, the story was far from over. Months passed, and the memory of Black Shuck began to fade, replaced by the demands of everyday life. But then, one night, I awoke to the sound of growling outside my window. I looked out and saw two glowing red eyes staring at me from the darkness. Black Shuck had found me. In the days that followed, I experienced a series of strange and terrifying events. Objects moved on their own, shadows seemed to follow me, and I was plagued by nightmares of the spectral hound. I knew that the curse was real, and that Black Shuck was not finished with me. Desperate for answers, I returned to Cromer and sought out Mrs. Havisham. She performed a cleansing ritual, invoking the protection of the spirits. She told me that the curse could be lifted, but only if I confronted Black Shuck one final time. That night, I returned to the ruins of St. Peter's Church, armed with nothing but my courage and a small talisman given to me by Mrs. Havisham. As the fog rolled in and the darkness deepened, I felt the familiar presence of the spectral hound. Black Shuck appeared, its eyes burning with malice. I stood my ground, clutching the talisman, and began to chant the words Mrs. Havisham had taught me. The air grew cold, and the ground trembled as the hound circled me, growling fiercely. With a final, deafening roar, Black Shuck lunged at me. But instead of attacking, it passed through me like a shadow, its form dissolving into the mist. The air grew still, and the fog lifted, revealing the clear night sky. The curse was broken. I returned home, my heart lighter and my mind at ease. The memory of Black Shuck remained, but the fear was gone. I had faced the spectral hound and lived to tell the tale, and in doing so, I had uncovered a truth that few dared to believe. The legend of Black Shuck was more than just a story, it was a testament to the power of the unknown, and a reminder that some mysteries are best left unsolved. But for those who dare to seek the truth, the rewards are beyond measure. I've always been a skeptic. I never believed in the supernatural or the legends that came with it. But what happened to me in the dense forests of northern Minnesota changed everything. My name is Oliver, and this is the story of how I encountered the Wendigo. It all started when my best friend, Jack, convinced me to join him on a winter hiking trip. Jack was an outdoor enthusiast, always seeking the thrill of the wild. I, on the other hand, was more of a city dweller. But Jack had a way of dragging me into his adventures, and this time was no different. We set off early in the morning, our backpacks loaded with supplies. The forest was beautiful, a winter wonderland with snow-covered trees, and a serene silence that felt almost otherworldly. We planned to hike to an old cabin that Jack had discovered on one of his previous trips. It was supposed to be a 2-day hike, with the promise of breathtaking views, and an escape from the hustle and bustle of city life. The first day went by without a hitch. We made good progress, following the trail markers and enjoying the crisp winter air. As the sun began to set, we set up camp in a small clearing and built a fire. The warmth was comforting, and the smell of the burning wood brought a sense of peace. After dinner, we sat around the fire, sharing stories and laughter. The night was clear, and the stars above were like tiny diamonds scattered across the sky. It was perfect, but as the fire began to die down, a chilling wind blew through the trees, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Jack noticed my discomfort and chuckled. "Scared of the dark, Ollie?" "Of course not," I replied, though my voice betrayed my unease. "Just not used to being out here, that's all." "Well, you'll get used to it," Jack said, tossing another log onto the fire. "Out here, you learn to respect the wild. It's beautiful but unforgiving." As the night grew colder, we decided to turn in. I crawled into my sleeping bag, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. The wind howled outside, and the trees creaked and groaned, as if whispering secrets to each other. Despite my exhaustion, I found it hard to sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke to a strange sound. It was a low, mournful wail, like the cry of a wounded animal. I sat up, my heart pounding, and listened. The sound came again, closer this time. I looked over at Jack, who was still fast asleep, undisturbed by the noise. Curiosity got the better of me, and I quietly unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint glow across the campsite. The wailing continued, and I felt an inexplicable urge to follow it. I grabbed a flashlight and started walking toward the sound. The forest was dark and eerie, the moonlight barely penetrating the thick canopy of trees. My breath formed clouds in the cold air as I moved deeper into the woods. The wailing grew louder, more desperate, and I quickened my pace, driven by a mix of fear and curiosity. After what felt like hours, I reached a small clearing. The wailing had stopped, and the silence was deafening. I shone my flashlight around, the beam cutting through the darkness. That's when I saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the trees. At first, I thought it was a person. But as the figure stepped into the light, I realized with horror that it was something else entirely. It was tall and emaciated, its skin stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin. My blood ran cold as I recognized the creature from the old legends Jack had mentioned during our hike. It was a Wendigo, a malevolent spirit of the forest, said to possess insatiable hunger and a thirst for human flesh. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. The Wendigo moved closer, its bony fingers reaching out toward me. I could feel its icy breath on my face, and the stench of decay filled my nostrils. Panic surged through me, and I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I tore through the forest, branches slashing at my face and clothes. The Wendigo's wails followed me, growing louder and more frantic. I didn't dare look back, fearing that if I did, I would see those glowing eyes and that twisted grin right behind me. Somehow, I made it back to the campsite. I collapsed next to Jack's tent, gasping for breath. Jack stirred and sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Ollie, what's going on?" "Wendigo," I managed to gasp. "It's out there. We have to go, now." Jack's expression changed from confusion to concern as he saw the fear in my eyes. He didn't ask questions. He quickly gathered our things, and we packed up the camp in record time. The wailing had stopped, but I could still feel the Wendigo's presence, watching us from the shadows. We set off at a brisk pace, trying to put as much distance between us and the Wendigo as possible. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees looming like silent sentinels. The trail was harder to follow in the darkness, and we stumbled several times, but we kept moving. As dawn approached, the first light of day began to filter through the trees. The forest seemed less menacing in the daylight, but the memory of the Wendigo's glowing eyes and twisted grin haunted me. We didn't stop until we reached the cabin, exhausted and on edge. The cabin was a small, rustic structure, but it offered a sense of safety. We locked the door and collapsed on the old wooden floor, trying to catch our breath. Jack looked at me, his expression serious. "Are you sure it was a Wendigo?" I nodded, still shaken. "I know what I saw, Jack. It was real, and it was hungry." We spent the next few days at the cabin, trying to regain our strength. The forest was quiet, and we didn't encounter any more signs of the Wendigo. But the fear never left me. I knew that we had been lucky to escape with our lives. When we finally made our way back to civilization, couldn't shake the feeling that the Wendigo was still out there, lurking in the shadows. The experience had changed me. I could no longer dismiss the supernatural as mere superstition. Back in the city, I did more research on the Wendigo. I discovered that sightings of the creature were not uncommon in the northern forests, and many people had vanished without a trace. The legends warned of its insatiable hunger and its ability to possess those who were weak or desperate. I realized how close I had come to becoming one of those lost souls. The Wendigo's whisper had called to me, and I had followed it into the darkness. I had seen the creature's true form, and I knew that it was not just a myth. Years have passed since that fateful trip, but I still think about the Wendigo. I wonder if it still roams the forests, searching for its next victim. I've never gone back to those woods, and I've warned others to stay away. The Wendigo is real, and its hunger is eternal. I was lucky to escape, but I know that others may not be so fortunate. The forest holds many secrets, and some of them are better left undisturbed. If you ever find yourself in the northern wilderness, remember my story. Be wary of the whispers in the night and the glowing eyes in the darkness. The Wendigo is out there, and it is always hungry. My name is Elena, and I used to live in a small town on the edge of the Navajo Nation in Arizona. The desert there is vast and unforgiving, with stretches of arid land broken up by rocky outcrops and sparse vegetation. It's a place where the line between the natural and the supernatural can blur, a place where ancient legends seemed to linger in the air. Growing up, it often heard stories about the Skinwalker Seville witches who could transform into animals and wreak havoc on those who crossed their paths. They were said to be able to control the minds of others, causing illness and misfortune. My grandmother, a wise old woman who adhered to the traditional ways, would warn me never to speak of them at night, lest they hear us and come calling. I never gave much thought to these stories. To me, they were just old tales meant to scare children. But that all changed during the summer when I turned 18. It was a summer that would forever alter my understanding of the world and my place in it. It began with the disappearance of a local boy named Miguel. He was a quiet kid, a few years younger than me, who often helped his parents tend to their small herd of goats. One day, he went out to the fields and never came back. His parents were frantic, and the whole town joined in the search. We combed the desert for days, but there was no sign of him. People started to whisper about the skinwalkers. Some said they had seen strange tracks in the sand, the kind that could only belong to a creature that was neither human nor animal. Others claimed to have heard eerie howls at night, sounds that sent chills down their spines. My grandmother, for the first time in my life, looked genuinely frightened. A week after Miguel's disappearance, my cousin Javier and I decided to camp out in the desert. We hoped to catch sight of some anything might explain what was happening. Javier was a skeptic like me, but he was also curious and adventurous. We packed our gear and set off at sunset, determined to stay up all night if we had to. We found a spot near a rocky outcrop and set up our camp. The desert was beautiful in the twilight, the sky painted in hues of orange and pink. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped, and the vastness of the landscape took on a more sinister feel. The silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of the wind. We built a small fire and sat close to it, trying to keep warm. Hours passed, and nothing happened. We talked about school, our families, and our plans for the future, trying to keep our spirits up. But as the night grew deeper, an uneasy feeling settled over us. Around midnight, we heard a distant howl, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It was a mournful, chilling sound that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. Javier and I exchanged worried glances. "Maybe it's just a coyote," he said, trying to sound reassuring. But I knew better. There was something unnatural about that howl. It seemed to echo through my bones, stirring a primal fear that I couldn't ignore. We sat in silence, listening. The howling came again, closer this time. And then we saw them eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness, watching us from the edge of the firelight. Javier grabbed his flashlight and shone it towards the eyes. The beam illuminated a figure standing a few yards away. It looked like a man, but its posture was all wrong, hunched over, with long limbs that ended in claw-like fingers. Its eyes reflected the light, giving them an otherworldly glow. My heart pounded in my chest. "Javier, we need to go," I whispered, my voice trembling. Before he could respond, the figure let out a low, guttural growl and began to move towards us. Javier and I bolted, abandoning our camp and running as fast as we could. The desert terrain was treacherous, but adrenaline kept us going. I could hear the creature behind us, its footsteps heavy and relentless. We reached the rocky outcrop and scrambled up the side, hoping to lose it among the boulders. I could feel my muscles burning, but I didn't dare stop. Javier was ahead of me, urging me to keep moving. We reached the top and collapsed, gasping for breath. For a moment, it seemed like we had escaped. The howling had stopped, and the night was eerily quiet. But then I saw it again, climbing up the rocks with a speed and agility that no human could match. It was close enough now that I could see its face twisted and contorted, with eyes that burned with malice. Desperation took over. I grabbed a loose rock and hurled it at the creature. It struck it in the chest, and the creature let out a roar of anger. But it didn't slow down. Javier and I knew we couldn't outrun it forever. In a moment of clarity, I remembered something my grandmother had told me. Skinwalkers were said to be vulnerable to certain traditional remedies and weapons. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small pouch of ash that my grandmother had given me, saying it was for protection. "Javier, the ash," I shouted, throwing some of it towards the creature. As the ash touched it, the creature recoiled, screeching in pain. Its skin seemed to burn and bubble where the ash had landed. Seizing the opportunity, Javier and I continued to throw ash at it until it finally retreated, disappearing into the darkness with one last agonizing howl. We didn't wait to see if it would come back. We climbed down the rocks and ran all the way back to town, not stopping until we reached the safety of my grandmother's house. She was waiting for us, her eyes filled with worry and relief. Over the next few days, we told our story to anyone who would listen. Some believed us, others didn't. But one thing was certain: disappearances stopped. The town returned to a semblance of normalcy, though the fear of the skinwalkers lingered. I never went back to the desert at night. The memory of that night haunted me, a constant reminder of the unseen dangers that lurked in the wild. I moved away for college, but I always kept the pouch of ash my grandmother had given me, a small token of protection against the unknown. Years later, I returned to visit my family. The town had changed, but the desert was still the same: vast, silent, and mysterious. As I stood on the edge of the desert, I felt a chill run down my spine. The legends were real, and the skinwalkers were out there, waiting. My encounter with the skinwalker taught me to respect the old stories and the wisdom they contained. They weren't just tales to scare children. They were warnings, passed down through generations. I learned to trust my instincts and to never underestimate the power of the unknown. So, if you ever find yourself in the desert at night, be careful. Listen to the wind and the whispers of the land. And if you hear a howl that chills your bones, run. Run as fast as you can, and don't look back. The skinwalkers are real, and they are always watching. I've always loved the quiet of the countryside. There's something soothing about the rolling fields, the whispering trees, and the sense of space and freedom. That's why I moved to Elkhorn, Wisconsin, a small town with a big heart and an even bigger secret. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of my encounter with the beast of Bray Road. I had just graduated from college and landed a job as a journalist for the local newspaper, the Elkhorn Gazette. The job was a perfect fit for me. It was quiet, it allowed me to write, and the people were friendly. My first few months were filled with typical small-town story-esque events, community highlights, and the occasional piece on local history. But one day I stumbled across something that piqued my curiosity. While going through the archives, I found a series of articles from the late 1980s and early 1990s about sightings of a strange creature on Bray Road. The descriptions varied, but the common thread was that it looked like a large, wolf-like beast that stood on two legs. Some locals called it a werewolf, others a Bigfoot, but everyone agreed on one thing: it was terrifying. I was intrigued. These stories had all the elements of a great Mr. Eyewitness accounts. Grainy photographs, and a sense of fear that had gripped the town for years. I decided to dig deeper and write a feature on the beast of Bray Road. Little did I know that this decision would lead me to a chilling encounter I would never forget. I started by interviewing the people who had reported sightings. Most of them were reluctant to talk, worried about being ridiculed. But a few were willing to share their experiences. One woman, Linda, told me about how she had seen the creature while driving home late one night. She described it as being over 6 feet tall, covered in dark fur, with glowing eyes and a snarling mouth full of sharp teeth. It was like nothing I've ever seen before, she said, her voice trembling. It looked right at me, like it was sizing me up. I've never been so scared in my life. Another man, Mike, recounted how he had seen the beast while out hunting. He had watched it from a distance, through the scope of his rifle. He swore it was walking on two legs, moving with an unnatural grace. I thought it was a bear at first, he said. But then it stood up, and I knew this was something else. Something not right. As I gathered these stories, a pattern began to emerge. The sightings were clustered around Bray Road, a lonely stretch of highway that cut through the countryside. Many of the encounters happened at night, and the creature seemed to be most active during the fall and winter months. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, I decided to spend a few nights staking out Bray Road. I borrowed a car from a friend and armed myself with a camera, a flashlight, and a notebook. On the first night, I parked at the side of the road and waited, the darkness enveloping me like a thick blanket. The hours passed slowly. I watched as the moon climbed higher in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. The silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of an owl. I felt a creeping sense of unease, but I brushed it off as nerves. Just after midnight, something caught my eye. A shadow moved at the edge of the field, near a line of trees. My heart began to race as I grabbed my flashlight and camera. I focused the beam on the spot, and for a moment, I saw nothing. But then, emerging from the shadows, I saw it, a hulking figure, covered in dark fur, standing on two legs. The beast of Bray Road. I couldn't believe my eyes. It was exactly as the witnesses had described it, powerful, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. It stood there, watching me, as if deciding what to do next. I fumbled with my camera, trying to capture a picture, but my hands were shaking too much. Suddenly, the creature let out a low growl, and I felt a wave of primal fear wash over me. I knew I had to get out of there. I scrambled back into the car and started the engine, my heart pounding in my chest. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the beast retreating into the woods, disappearing into the night. The next day, I tried to process what had happened. I had seen the beast with my own eyes, but I had no proof, no photographs, no physical evidence. I knew that telling my story without proof would be risky, but I also knew that I had to share what I had experienced. I wrote my article, detailing the history of the beast of Bray Road, the eyewitness accounts, and my own encounter. The piece caused quite a stir in Elkhorn. Some people were fascinated, others skeptical, but it reignited the debate about the existence of the creature. In the weeks that followed, more sightings were reported. People came forward with their own stories, and the local authorities even organized a few search parties, though nothing concrete was ever found. The mystery of the beast of Bray Road remained unsolved, but it had become a part of the town's folklore. As for me, I continued my work at the Gazette, but I never went back to Bray Road at night. The encounter had left a mark on me, a lingering sense of fear and awe. I knew that there were things in this world that defied explanation, and sometimes it was best to leave them be. Years later, I moved away from Elkhorn, but the memory of that night stayed with me. Whenever I hear the howl of a wolf, or see the moon shining brightly in the sky, I think of the beast of Bray Road and the sense of wonder and terror it inspired. The countryside is still beautiful to me, but I now understand that it holds its own secrets and dangers. And while I may never know what the beast truly was, I am grateful for the experience. It taught me to respect the unknown and to keep an open mind, for there are more things in heaven and earth than we can ever imagine. So, if you ever find yourself driving down Bray Road on a dark, moonlit night, keep your eyes open. You might just catch a glimpse of the beast, watching from the shadows, a reminder that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. My name is Alex, and this story takes place in the remote backcountry of Utah. My friend Ethan and I had always been drawn to the great outdoors. Hiking, camping, and exploring were second nature to us. So, when we heard about a series of abandoned cabins deep in the woods, we couldn't resist the lure of adventure. The cabins were rumored to have been deserted for decades, and local legends spoke of strange occurrences and unexplained phenomena in the area. Most notably, The locals whispered about Skinwalker sinister shape-shifting witches from Navajo lore. They were said to be able to transform into animals, and had a penchant for causing chaos and fear. Ethan and I, being the skeptics we were, dismissed these stories as mere folklore. We packed our gear and set out early one Friday morning, eager to uncover the mystery of the cabins. The hike was long and arduous, but the scenery was breathtaking. Tall pines towered overhead, and the air was filled with the scent of pine needles and earth. As we ventured deeper into the forest, the trail became less distinct, and we had to rely on our map and compass. By late afternoon, we reached the first cabin. It was a small, weather-beaten structure with a sagging roof and broken windows. Despite its dilapidated state, it had a certain charm, as if it held stories waiting to be told. We decided to set up camp nearby and explore the area. That night, as we sat around the campfire, we talked about our plans for the next day. We wanted to check out the other cabins and see if we could find any clues about their history. The fire crackled and cast eerie shadows on the trees, creating an atmosphere that was both thrilling and unsettling. Around midnight, we heard a distant howl that echoed through the woods. It was unlike any animal sound we had ever heard, a haunting, mournful cry that sent shivers down my spine. Ethan and I exchanged uneasy glances. Probably just a coyote, Ethan said, though he didn't sound convinced. We tried to brush it off, but the howling continued, growing louder and more persistent. There was something unnerving about it, something that made me feel like we were being watched. We decided to call it a night and retreated to our tent, but sleep didn't come easily. In the early hours of the morning, I was jolted awake by a loud rustling sound outside the tent. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to listen. Ethan was already awake, clutching a flashlight. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. He nodded, his face pale in the dim light. We grabbed our knives and slowly unzipped the tent, stepping out into the cool night air. The campfire had died down to glowing embers, casting a faint light. We scanned the area, but saw nothing. Just as we were about to head back into the tent, we saw movement near the edge of the clearing. A large, shadowy figure was lurking among the trees, watching us with glowing eyes. It was too dark to make out any details, but the sight filled me with a sense of dread. "Who's there?" Ethan called out, his voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it let out a low growl and took a step closer. We backed away, fear gripping us. I could feel my instincts screaming at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. Then, without warning, the figure lunged at us. It moved with unnatural speed and agility, its form shifting and contorting as it approached. Ethan and I turned and bolted, racing through the forest with the creature hot on our heels. My mind was a whirlwind of terror and confusion. What were we dealing with? We ran until we couldn't run anymore, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. We stumbled upon another cabin, this one larger and slightly more intact. We burst through the door and slammed it shut behind us, leaning against it as we tried to catch our breath. The interior of the cabin was musty and dark, with old furniture covered in dust. We could hear the creature outside, prowling around, its growls reverberating through the walls. We knew we couldn't stay there forever, but we needed a plan. "We need to figure out what it is," Ethan said, his voice trembling. "If it's a skinwalker, there must be a way to stop it." I racked my brain, trying to remember what little I knew about skinwalkers. They were said to be powerful witches who could take on the form of animals. But they had weaknesses traditionally. They could be repelled by certain herbs or killed with a knife dipped in white ash. "We need to find some white ash," I said. "It's our only chance." We searched the cabin, hoping to find something that could help us. In a corner, we found an old fireplace with a pile of ash. It wasn't white ash, but it was better than nothing. We rubbed the ash on our knives, praying it would be enough. Just as we finished, the creature began to pound on the door, its claws scratching against the wood. The door shook under the force of its blows, and I knew it wouldn't hold for long. We had to act fast. On three, we open the door and attack, Ethan said. I nodded, gripping my knife tightly. 1, 2, 3, we threw open the door, and charged at the creature. It reared back in surprise, its form shifting between that of a man and a beast. We slashed at it with our knives, the ash burning its flesh where it made contact. The creature let out a horrifying screech and retreated into the darkness. We didn't wait to see if it would come back. We ran through the woods, adrenaline fueling our escape. By the time we reached the safety of our car, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. We didn't stop until we were back in town, exhausted, but alive. We reported our encounter to the local authorities, but they were skeptical. The story spread, though, and the townspeople were divided. Some believed us, while others thought we were just telling tall tales. Ethan and I knew the truth, though. We had faced something ancient and evil, something that defied explanation. The experience left us shaken, but it also forged an unbreakable bond between us. We never went back to those cabins, and we never spoke of the Skinwalker again. But sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that haunting howl, echoing through my dreams. It's a reminder that there are things in this world we may never fully understand, things that lurk in the shadows, waiting to be discovered. And if you ever find yourself in the backcountry of Utah, remember this story. Keep your wits about you, and always be prepared for the unexpected. For the Skinwalker's curse is real, and it's out there, watching, waiting, and ready to strike. My name is James, and I'm an outdoorsman to the core. I've always loved the solitude of the wilderness, the sense of freedom it brings. But one winter, deep in the forests of northern Minnesota, I encountered something that changed my life forever. This is the story of my brush with the Wendigo. It all began in late November. I had decided to take a solo hunting trip before the snow got too deep. The forest was my sanctuary, a place where I could escape the hustle and bustle of city life. I packed my gear, loaded my rifle, and set out for a remote cabin that I often used as a base camp. The cabin was old but sturdy, nestled in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. The nearest town was over 50 miles away, and there was no cell service this far out. It was perfect. I planned to stay for a week, living off the land and enjoying the peace and quiet. The first few days were uneventful. I hunted during the day and spent the evenings by the fire, reading and relaxing. The weather was cold but clear, and I managed to bag a couple of deer to stock up on meat. But on the fourth night, things took a sinister turn. I was sitting by the fire, sipping a cup of hot coffee, when I heard a distant, mournful wail that echoed through the trees. It was unlike any animal sound I had ever heard, a chilling cry that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but deep down I knew something was wrong. The wailing continued sporadically throughout the night, each time closer than before. I didn't sleep much, my mind racing with thoughts of what could be making that sound. By morning, the forest seemed eerily silent, as if holding its breath. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I decided to track the source of the noise. I packed my gear and set out, following the faint echoes of the wail. The forest was dense and unforgiving, but I was an experienced tracker, and I moved with confidence. After several hours of hiking, I came across something strange, large, deep footprints in the snow. They looked almost human, but were much larger, with elongated toes and a strange, claw-like shape. My gut told me to turn back, but curiosity got the better of me. I followed the tracks deeper into the woods. As the sun began to set, I found myself in a part of the forest I had never seen before. The trees were ancient, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the fading light. The air was thick with an oppressive, almost tangible sense of dread. I stumbled upon a small clearing, and what I saw there froze me in my tracks. In the center of the clearing was a grotesque figure, hunched over and gnawing on a carcass. It was emaciated, with skin stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes glowed with a malevolent hunger. I knew immediately what it was: a Wendigo. The creature looked up, its eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then it let out a blood-curdling scream and charged at me with terrifying speed. I raised my rifle and fired, the shot echoing through the forest. The Wendigo staggered, but didn't fall. I fired again and again, but it kept coming. Panicking, I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the Wendigo behind me, its ragged breaths growing closer. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees a blur as I raced for my life. I didn't stop until I reached the cabin, slamming the door shut and bolting it behind me. I could hear the Wendigo outside, its growls and scratching at the door sending waves of terror through me. I knew the cabin wouldn't hold it for long. Desperate, I searched for anything that could help me fight it off. I remembered an old legend I had heard about the Wendigo that it could be driven away by fire. I grabbed a can of kerosene and a box of matches, my hands shaking as I prepared to make my stand. The Wendigo crashed through the door, its eyes burning with hunger and rage. I threw the kerosene at it and struck a match, tossing it onto the creature. The Wendigo erupted into flames, letting out a piercing scream as it writhed and thrashed. The fire consumed it, and I watched in horror and fascination as the creature was reduced to ash. The smell of burning flesh filled the cabin, and I collapsed to the floor, exhausted and terrified. The next morning, I packed up my things and left the cabin, not daring to look back. I made my way back to civilization, my mind reeling from the encounter. I knew I could never tell anyone what had happened. Nethy would think I was crazy. But I also knew that I had to leave the forest behind. The place that had once been my sanctuary had become a nightmare. Years have passed since that fateful trip, but the memory of the Wendigo haunts me still. I've read more about the legend, learning that the Wendigo is a symbol of insatiable hunger and greed, a creature driven by a need that can never be satisfied. It's said that those who encounter a Wendigo are marked by it, forever changed by the experience. I've tried to move on with my life, but there are nights when I wake up in a cold sweat, the Wendigo's wail echoing in my ears. I've taken to living in the city, surrounded by people and noise, trying to drown out the memory. But deep down, I know that the Wendigo is still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. So if you ever find yourself in the forests of northern Minnesota, beware. The Wendigo is real, and it's always hungry. Keep to the trails, stay close to the fire, and never, ever follow the wail. For once you hear it, the Wendigo has already marked you, and there is no escape from its curse. My name is Tom, and this is the story of my encounter with the Skinwalker, a memory that haunts me to this day. I was born and raised in Arizona, spending my childhood in the shadow of the Navajo Nation. The stories and legends of the area were as much a part of my upbringing as the desert itself. But none struck fear in my heart as much as the tales of the Skinwalker. It was the summer of 2018. My best friend, Mike, and I decided to take a week-long hiking trip through the Navajo reservation. We had always been fascinated by the stark beauty of the desert, and we planned our route meticulously, making sure to stay within safe boundaries and respect the land. Our journey began without incident. We trekked through the arid landscape, marveling at the red rock formations and the vast, open sky. The first few days were peaceful, filled with the kind of tranquility that only the desert can offer. But on the fourth night, everything changed. We had set up camp near a cluster of ancient ruins. The sun had just set, casting long shadows across the desert floor. As we sat around our campfire, cooking dinner and sharing stories, we were joined by a local Navajo man named Ben. He had been out herding sheep and stopped by to chat with us. He was friendly and knowledgeable, and we welcomed his company. As the night wore on, our conversation turned to local legends. Mike, always the skeptic, asked Ben about the Skinwalkers. Ben's demeanor changed instantly, his face growing serious. "It's not something we talk about lightly," he said, his voice low. "Skinwalkers are dangerous, evil beings. They are witches who can take the form of animals to cause harm. Mike laughed it off, but I could see the fear in Ben's eyes. He warned us to be cautious, and left soon after, leaving an uneasy silence behind. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had disturbed something we shouldn't have. That night, I was awoken by a strange noise outside the tent. It was a rustling sound, like something moving through the brush. I listened intently, my heart pounding. The noise grew louder, closer. I nudged Mike awake, and we both strained to hear. Suddenly, there was a low growl, followed by a series of strange, guttural sounds. It was unlike any animal I had ever heard. Mike grabbed his flashlight and unzipped the tent, shining the light into the darkness. The beam illuminated a pair of glowing eyes, reflecting back at us from the edge of the campsite. We scrambled out of the tent, our flashlights scanning the area. The eyes disappeared, but we could still hear the rustling. I felt a chill run down my spine, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me. Mike suggested we build up the fire, hoping it would keep whatever was out there at bay. As we fed more wood into the flames, I noticed something: strange tracks in the sand around our campsite. They were large, almost human, but with elongated toes and deep, claw-like indentations. I pointed them out to Mike, and his face paled. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. We stayed up the rest of the night, keeping the fire burning and our flashlights ready. The sounds continued, growing more frantic and aggressive. At one point, I saw a shadow move at the edge of the firelight, a hulking, distorted figure that seemed to melt into the darkness. By dawn, the noises had stopped, but the fear lingered. We packed up our camp quickly, deciding to cut our trip short and head back. As we hiked out, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The desert, once a place of beauty and wonder, now felt hostile and oppressive. We reached our car by late afternoon, exhausted and shaken. As we drove away, glanced back at the desert, half expecting to see something following us. But there was nothing, just the vast, empty expanse. In the days that followed, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was just an animal, a coyote, or a mountain lion. But deep down, I knew better. I knew that we had encountered something unnatural, something malevolent. I reached out to Ben, hoping to find some answers. He met with me, his face grim as I recounted our experience. When I showed him the tracks, he nodded solemnly. "You were lucky to get away," he said. "Skinwalkers are powerful and dangerous. Once they've marked you, they don't easily let go." He gave me a small pouch filled with herbs and told me to burn them if I ever felt threatened again. "It will keep them at bay," he said. "But be careful. The desert is full of old magic, and not all of it is friendly." I took his warning to heart. I still love the desert, but I have a newfound respect for its dangers. The encounter left me with a deep sense of unease, a feeling that something is always watching, waiting. And I have no desire to meet the Skinwalker again. If you ever find yourself in the Navajo Nation, remember this story. Respect the land and its legends, and be wary of the things that go bump in the night. Because sometimes, those things are real, and they are far more terrifying than any ghost story.